Amidst the desolate battlefield covered in white snow and corpses, the sky glowed with a purple hue as if witnessing the end of a bloody era. Meanwhile, a blood-stained warrior suddenly realized in shock that he had just suffered a fatal blow to a vital spot. The church's holy sword had pierced his heart with pinpoint accuracy, making every breath heavy and fragmented amidst agonizing, bone-deep pain. His adversaries joyfully exclaimed that the mission was accomplished and they had finally taken down their sworn enemy after so much effort. The one known as the continent's devil had his body pierced by countless swords and arrows, turning him into a heavily wounded meat shield. The necromancer tyrant Archimond stood silently surrounded, looking at the blades buried deep in his flesh with eyes that retained their pride despite his exhaustion. Facing those resentment-filled faces, he gritted his teeth, secretly thinking that his breath would soon fade in this unequal battle. The 10-year-long expedition ended with a sophisticated coordinated strike, where the royal army acted as bait for an elite squad to ambush from behind. Despite having prepared the most solid defensive countermeasures, Archimond bitterly realized that his calculations had ultimately vanished into thin air before the enemy's might. Standing on the white bones of countless fallen soldiers, he closed his eyes, accepting that this was the perfect and absolute defeat of his life. All these unexpected turning points stemmed from the appearance of a single knight, who was tightly gripping a glowing sword and voicing his assertion that he was not alone in this arduous battle. He explained that it was only thanks to countless people who shed their blood to hold the front lines that this blade could finally reach Archimond's body, then ordered the enemy to drop their weapons immediately for the sake of bringing eternal peace to the entire continent. In the face of those words, Archimond roared, demanding the opponent shut his mouth with an extremely furious and disdainful attitude. He loudly criticized the knights who only stood by and watched when the plague ravaged and killed the people, yet now dared to preach morality like beings worse than beasts. Even though the opposing knight's eyes maintained a cold and steadfast look in the face of those bitter accusations, Archimond continued to curse all of them as the most disgusting hypocrites in this world. While a fierce burst of dark energy erupted around his body, showing his determination to personally end all of humanity with his final strength. The sudden surge of that terrifying magical power made the surrounding soldiers tremble in shock, sensing the aura of death enveloping them. The soldiers were stunned to see the enemy, despite being on the verge of death, still trying to cast a final necromancy spell amidst the encirclement. But Knight Burkle coldly ordered everyone to stand down, ignoring his subordinates' concerns that disaster would strike if they didn't finish off Archimond immediately. He brought up the figure of 20 million people who had fallen to the pandemic, those pitiful souls turned into a brutal undead army by Archimond's hands. That very blasphemous act became the spark that ignited the bloody war spanning the past decade, sowing terror across the continent. Hearing this, Archimond gritted his teeth in resentment and retorted, asking if his opponent thought he was completely unaware of the sins he had committed. He bluntly mocked that perhaps Burkle's loved ones were also among them, meaning the true purpose of this expedition was essentially just a personal vendetta. Standing in the freezing snow, Burkle lowered his voice, demanding the enemy to speak up and deny it if he truly believed the knight's reasons were flawed. Because the real goal that made him swing this glowing sword on the desolate battlefield was not simply driven by hatred. Burkle boldly declared that all the sacrifices and efforts made thus far were, after all, just to protect a better future for the younger generation. That idealistic answer left Archimond so stunned that his whole body went stiff, unable to believe what he had just heard right on the boundary between life and death. Burkle affirmed that he had to entrust all his choices, beliefs, and hopes to the youth of tomorrow. In that moment, Archimond suddenly realized his own decaying and sinful reflection vividly mirrored in his opponent's eyes. And it was in that resolute gaze that the contrast between good and evil seemed to become sharper than ever before. Blinding rays of sunlight began tearing through the gloomy clouds as if heaven was opening a path to witness the historical moment of a righteous knight. Burkle's face radiated nobility due to his ideal of protecting future generations, making Archimond feel completely filthy in the presence of such purity. The necromancer tyrant completely collapsed in his own pool of blood, his breathing turning fragmented as death drew closer than ever. Burkle raised his weapon high, ready to deliver the final killing blow to completely end the existence of the one branded a devil. But to everyone's astonishment, he suddenly dropped his holy sword to the ground, ignoring the horrified cries of protest echoing from behind. Instead, he slowly drew out a mystical purple-hued blade and asserted that he still had one last thing he needed to do. Standing before the defenseless enemy, the knight coldly asked if Archimond had any final words before leaving this world. Archimond gave an arrogant smile despite his blood-soaked face, asserting that a necromancer like him would never fall so easily. He quietly closed his eyes and waited, preparing to embrace the final punishing blow amidst the sorrow-tinted snowfall. Burkle forcefully swung the sword that radiated a chilling aura, swearing that one day everything would truly come to an absolute end. The fatal slash tore through space at a terrifying speed, rendering the sinner's last hope meaningless. In Archimond's fading eyes, the mystical purple rays flared up as if signaling a new beginning from the realm of the dead. The knight's ironclad hand tightly gripped the ancient hilt, where glowing runes bore witness to the end of a dark era. Cheers echoed across the expanse as the troops shouted in unison that the one known as the devil had finally paid for his sins. Lying silently on the cold ground, Archimond could still feel the sharp, cold sound as his neck was severed amidst the celebratory shouts of his enemies. Watching the silhouettes dancing joyfully in the dim light, he silently let out a melancholic sigh for a mortal life so fraught with hatred. This earth-shattering event officially closed the 10 years of continental war filled with blood and tears, leaving behind a haunting silence for those who remain. The last flickering speck of light closed the final chapter on the life of Archimond, the one once feared by the whole world under the title of the continent's devil. Right at that moment, amidst the pouring rain and roaring thunder, a magnificent mansion appeared as if hiding a newly sprouted secret. The sensation of free-falling through the void disappeared, making way for an eerily strange silence in a completely unfamiliar space. Two maids were overjoyed upon discovering that the young master's tiny lips had just made a gentle movement. Archimond, in the form of a child, bewilderedly asked himself what the hell was happening to him after just being on the verge of death. He looked around the luxurious room with skeptical eyes while hearing the respectful greetings meant for the young master named Klein. A maid excitedly showed a photo inside a necklace and introduced that this noble woman was his mother. Feeling his entire body incredibly stiff and uncomfortable, he helplessly watched the maid trying to urge him to say mother. Archimond struggled to let out the first babbling sounds of his life under the persistent patience of the surrounding women. That effort left the maids utterly amazed, cheering that the young master had begun speaking earlier than normal people. In the body of a babbling child, Archimond, with a face full of authority, still attempted to summon his dark guards and demon legions. He raised his tiny fist high, screaming and demanding everyone to obey while the surrounding maids could only stand and watch in bewilderment. Reacting to that arrogant summoning, a blazing bolt of lightning suddenly streaked across the night sky like an omen of an ancient power awakening. The heavy rain poured down on the statue in the middle of the mansion's fountain, as if silently washing away the last traces of a bloody era. 15 years quickly passed, and the garden of the past was now peaceful and magnificent under the brilliant sunlight of a clear blue day. The maids couldn't help but gasp in awe as they witnessed a silhouette glide by, hurriedly asking each other if they saw that extraordinary beauty. The poised footsteps of a young man struck the paved stone path, exuding a cold yet captivating aura that instilled fear and respect in others. All eyes were drawn to the silver-white hair and flawless facial features that just passed by, looking like a god descending among mortals. The teenage boy walked with full confidence before the admiration of everyone around him, praised as a living masterpiece painstakingly sculpted by the gods. That sharp gaze and deeply silent, stoic expression were the clearest proof of the perfect reincarnation of an entity that once shook the entire continent. The maids gathered around, praising that the young master still shone perfectly today and wondering out loud what he used to achieve such radiant beauty. Meanwhile, the young man only maintained a cold, distant expression, ignoring the endless stream of compliments ringing in his ears. Suddenly, a bucket of water splashed right onto his head, startling him, accompanied by a triumphant cheer that the target had finally been found. Priest Garrison Jerkman of the church, who had just thrown the water, roared demanding the evil spirit to vanish immediately and return purity. He observed his reaction and muttered to himself that it was bizarre how he just wore the exact same expression as the cursed tyrant Archimond. The terrified maid stepped aside as Garrison breathed a sigh of relief, believing the purification ritual happened just in time before the demon could spread its power. The soaking wet teenager raised an eyebrow and asked if the other party didn't get bored performing this meaningless purification ritual for so many years. Hearing that, Priest Garrison quickly retorted and asserted that Archimond's soul was still lurking inside his body, so periodic purification was absolutely mandatory. Even though he tried to affirm he wasn't that tyrant, Garrison continued spraying water in his face and yelled that the devil's face had just appeared again. Faced with the priest's excessive and blind enthusiasm, the young man could only silently sigh and inwardly suspect whether there was something wrong with the man's brain. Archimond walked away, muttering curses that the priest was truly the sickest psychopath he had ever met. Immediately, Garrison ordered his followers to quickly restrain and drag this stubborn young master away. The teenager ran for his life while screaming to affirm his name was Klein, not the tyrant Archimond, despite the opponent threatening to subject him to the punishment of bathing naked in holy water. Watching the vividly returning memory bubbles, he thought to himself that he never expected his life to turn into such a bizarre scenario. Because the entity named Archimond was supposed to have vanished forever into nothingness since that bitter fateful day. Despite clearly remembering his own beheading, when he opened his eyes, he was horrified to find himself in the body of a child, uttering an incantation of necromancy instead of a newborn's cry. It was that very abnormality that terrified everyone into seeing him as the incarnation of the devil, leading to his fate of being thrown into a monastery under house arrest when he was just 3 years old. Sitting alone in a dark room with a highly guarded gaze, that was also the moment he first encountered the man calling himself the priest of the Supreme Church. Garrison's massive shadow cast long across the floor as he slowly stepped through the door, bringing along an invisible pressure that engulfed the tight space. The old man gave a meaningful smirk when he almost called out the name Archimond directly before correcting it to young Master Klein, officially beginning a chain of highly troublesome events later on. For 24 hours a day, Garrison forced him to listen to heavily religious prayers that made his ears and eyes start bleeding from information overload. It didn't stop there. The former tyrant also had to endure the torment of being thrown into a bathtub full of ice and garlic, a bizarre purification method by the eccentric priest. The climax of the madness was when he was tied tightly to a cross amidst blazing flames, while Garrison calmly prayed for the fire to burn away the evil aura. Under the guise of a noble purification ritual, Archimond had to experience all kinds of torture, causing his desperate cries for help to echo throughout the vast mansion. 5 years later, the teenage boy Klein now appeared with a tired and bored look, still wearing a flashy birthday hat on his head like an irony to his life. Erin, the loyal maid, was clasping her hands in prayer, hoping young Master Klein would inherit the heroic bloodline and soon become the solid pillar of the family. While she was still engrossed in praying in the name of the Lord, he could only gaze far away with dull eyes, feeling his final patience slowly running out. Unable to endure it any longer, he angrily threw off the hat and yelled that he had had enough of these troublesome hypocritical acts. That spontaneous action left Erin heartbrokenly stunned. She choked up and blurted out that it was a gift she had painstakingly prepared with her own hands for the young master. Seeing the little girl's sad face, he suddenly regretted his hot temper and silently apologized to Erin for not appreciating the effort of those small hands. Klein was about to pick up the hat to make amends with Erin, but immediately stopped when he heard her reveal that Priest Garrison was the one who personally made that gift. He stood frozen looking at the toy in his hand, feeling a sense of disgust creeping into his mind when thinking of the one who meticulously created it. The young man's expression suddenly turned into sheer terror and extreme disgust, as if he had just touched the filthiest evil object in the world. Right at that moment, Priest Garrison appeared from behind enveloped in a dark shadow, slowly calling out to young Master Klein with a highly probing tone. The old priest raised his hand to wipe away fake tears and exclaimed that he was extremely moved to see him wearing the hat he had personally spent the whole week making. Klein immediately used his strength to tear the gift into pieces, while fiercely declaring that he would never touch the old man's freaky things again. Garrison quickly seized the opportunity to proclaim that Archimond's evil nature had been revealed, even as the boy screamed, demanding the old priest to get lost with those crazy words. The chaos temporarily stopped when Commander Dumpy of the Red Chariot Knights entered the room, politely asking if today's purification ritual had truly ended. The commander lowered his voice and reiterated that the rumor of Klein being the reincarnated tyrant had actually existed for over 10 years and was making everyone extremely tired. He affirmed that the church had confirmed this body was completely normal, even though Klein was still frantically using his hands to push Garrison's detestable face away. Garrison turned and waved a warm greeting to Commander Dunkel, affirming that he would certainly fulfill the request of the Knight Order's representative. Meanwhile, Klein was still kneeling flat on the floor with a resentful expression as he watched the old priest casually laugh and talk about delaying documents with a person of authority. The young man silently mocked that the old man was truly a seasoned political player upon witnessing Garrison coldly turn his back and prepare to leave. Suddenly, the old priest stopped, leaning his scar-covered face close to Klein with a highly threatening gaze. He asserted that there would always be unexpected variables in this world, leaving Klein to just stare in silence with sweat running down his forehead. After that haunting warning, his black boots slowly pounded on the floor toward the doorway to end the conversation. However, he suddenly poked his head back in to tease about the next purification on Friday, driving Klein crazy and making him scream, demanding the old man to quickly disappear from his sight. He stood there panting out of frustration, while the maid Erin and Commander Dunkel were still standing motionless behind him. Too exhausted by these ridiculous theatricals, Klein threw himself down onto the soft sofa as if he had just escaped a living hell. He sat deep in thought with crossed arms, wondering how someone who specialized in tormenting others like the old man could righteously claim to be an orthodox clergyman. Aaron worriedly handed him a towel and wonderingly asked if the young master was truly no longer Archimond, because old Garrison looked even more like a demon than he did. Klein immediately brushed it off and swore that he didn't even want to hear that unlucky name for another second in his life. He thought to himself that if he admitted his identity, there was no telling what kind of torment the old priest would come up with next, while his body was still exhausted from being excessively purified. Ever since his reincarnation, his life had always been under strict surveillance, and he was imprisoned for 7 whole years in the monastery just because of a childhood rumor. Having just returned to the Duke's mansion only to be haunted by the old priest, Klein ruffled his hair in frustration and complained, despite Commander Dunkel speaking up to explain on the old man's behalf. Aaron curiously asked what the title of executioner actually was and whether it was an incredibly powerful position within the church. The commander remained silent for a moment before beginning to reveal the true nature hidden behind the authoritative name that old Garrison held. He asserted that it was a title reserved exclusively for the strongest within the church's ranks, an entity possessing absolute overwhelming power. Aside from the current duke of this family, almost no one was capable of standing firm against the pressure from the old man's muscular back and magical power. While Aaron cheered excitedly about the family's might, Klein could only sit trembling on the sofa and silently curse his ironic fate. Aaron wonderingly asked who was the strongest duke in the family, causing Klein, who was drying his hair, to suddenly stop. Commander Dunkel smiled and opined that the current 7th Duke was undoubtedly the top in terms of strength. However, Klein immediately spoke up to deny that opinion, causing everyone's attention to focus on him. The teenager firmly asserted that the first-generation Duke was truly the strongest in history. His serious expression made Dunkel just stay silent and offer no further comments. The commander had to accept the young master's judgment, while Aaron happily concluded that he greatly admired that great ancestor. Despite being teased about liking to look at that portrait, deep down Klein knew that his feelings for his old enemy were much more complex. Dunkel marveled at the long journey of 200 years since the founding duke began to build this legacy. The number of 2 centuries appeared in Klein's mind as a reminder of the seemingly endless time since he fell on the battlefield. Looking deep into the past, the necromancer tyrant Archimond told himself that he had to accept the truth about this highly ironic new life. Klein suddenly stopped when he heard Dunkel ask a question about the duke possessing the strongest power in the family's history. The commander smiled and affirmed that although there were many geniuses at present, the first generation was still the greatest. The portrait of Berkel Rhineland appeared majestically, symbolizing the peak of power and pride of the bloodline. The young man gritted his teeth at the ironic truth that he had been reincarnated as the descendant of the very person who murdered him in the past. In the nightmare, Archimond screamed his enemy's name during the moment the boundary between life and death was gradually closing before his eyes. In response to that fury, the knight coldly declared the reason for his presence on this bloody battlefield was to protect the future for the generations to come with a slash carrying massive energy that tore through space. Archimond completely collapsed under the annihilating attack, letting darkness and death swallow his mind. Klein suddenly woke up panting heavily, his face in shock as if he had just experienced that deadly slash once again. He sat silently in the middle of the luxurious room, trying to regulate his wildly beating heart due to the haunting echoes of the past. Klein clicked his tongue and told himself that it was indeed a terrible dream while reminiscing about the glorious days of the illustrious necromancer tyrant Archimond, the one who once went mad with rage and almost destroyed the entire continent before being mercilessly finished off by the sword of Knight Berkel Rhineland. He was shocked to realize that after 200 years, he had been reincarnated as the descendant of the very sworn enemy who had murdered him in the past. Klein raised his hand to stroke his unfamiliar silver hair and thought to himself that he would never be able to get used to this entirely new appearance. Right at that moment, Priest Garrison suddenly appeared from the darkness and mockingly spoke up that young Master Klein had just talked in his sleep during his deep slumber again. The old man flashed a sinister smile and pressed to ask whether he had just dreamed of the glorious years of the tyrant Archimond. Klein tried to explain that he was just too exhausted, but the maid Aaron rushed over and screamed that she had heard the whole truth. The little girl, full of excitement, continued to assert that her own ears had heard extremely bizarre words coming from the young master's mouth. Aaron repeatedly mimicked the tyrant's commands to destroy the continent, leaving Klein with no choice but to frantically demand her to shut up immediately. The chaos was interrupted when head butler Berkman entered to announce that the swordplay exhibition was about to begin, while Garrison also didn't forget to send his thanks to Aaron for the information just now. Garrison smiled sinisterly with glowing eyes, asserting that the number of young Master Klein's purification sessions would have to be doubled from now on to thoroughly eradicate the evil aura. Hearing that terrifying threat, Klein immediately covered Aaron's mouth tightly with his hand to prevent the girl from uttering any more words to his disadvantage. The brilliant morning sunlight enveloped the entire Duke's mansion, where an important event was about to take place, drawing all the attention of the family members. Klein's poised footsteps pounded on the corridor as he curiously asked the butler if a swordplay exhibition was being held today. The butler respectfully confirmed his words and further informed him that the Duke himself had ordered the young master to participate in this ceremony as well. Klein couldn't help but be surprised to learn that his father wanted him to be present there, while Aaron, standing behind, was still stammering, seemingly about to say something important. Head butler Berkman immediately spoke up to scold Aaron for bothering the young master with rude requests, just as Klein handed her a sweet cookie. He asked Berkman not to be too harsh on the little girl upon seeing Aaron munching on the cookie with an incredibly happy and content face. The atmosphere in the mansion became more somber as he was informed that several relatives from the family's side branches had also begun arriving to pay a visit. Standing under the brilliant chandelier, Klein secretly wondered why his father had suddenly changed his habit and called him to attend an exhibition to which he had never been invited before. Klein remained silent upon hearing about the arrival of the people from the side branches of the illustrious Rhineland family. The troublesome fellows with smug faces began to buzz with gossip the moment they noticed his presence in the distance. The crowd kept laughing and mockingly suggesting that everyone should show respect by calling him the great master Archimond. The arrogant cousins whispered disdainfully about the time he spent imprisoned in the monastery and joked that they should be careful not to be cursed by him. In another corner, the distant relatives from the north were engrossed in eating like professional freeloaders, making Klein feel extremely disgusted. His gaze swept over toward his cousins from the west, where a highly powerful figure sat deep in thought on the sofa. It was a beautiful young lady who exuded a haughty, cold aura and didn't seem to care at all about the surrounding chaos. Despite the insults calling him deaf or an idiot, Klein maintained an indifferent face and ignored all the petty provocations. As he coldly turned his back to walk away, a guy shouted loudly that trash like him did not deserve to be present in this illustrious lineage. In response to the fury of the self-proclaimed elders screaming behind him, he only inwardly smirked with contempt at the so-called family they were boasting about. Klein glanced over at the crowd with a look of disdain, thinking to himself that he didn't care about the names of these side branch members in the context of a gradually declining family. From the brightly lit balcony, he observed their arrogance and realized that his position as a direct heir was being openly looked down upon. Down on the training ground, clashing metallic sounds rang out as two warriors poured their strength into a dramatic sword duel, with sharp sword strikes tearing through the air. Dalton, with his furiously burning purple hair, gritted his teeth and roared Delane's name, swearing that he would make his opponent pay for his arrogance. However, all of Dalton's offensive efforts became futile as he completely lost his footing and almost stumbled before his opponent's agility. In his fury, he continued to charge forward and screamed at Deline to stop dodging and face him properly like real men. In response to that loss of control, Deline coldly asserted that the match had ended long ago, while Dalton stubbornly kept screaming that he had not yet failed. Delane's handsome face appeared full of confidence. He was the only remaining ray of hope to revive the reputation of a family on the brink of collapse. As the eldest son and a natural-born sword prodigy, Deline flashed a gentle smile that made Klein feel like he was facing a highly difficult problem. Watching the match from afar, Klein silently admitted that it was the exceptional talent of this half-brother that helped the family maintain its title as an illustrious swordsman clan. Dalton roared furiously that this time would be different and charged straight at Deline with a fierce attack. Meanwhile, Klein quietly observed with eyes glowing with a purple hue, thinking that this was the first time he had witnessed peak swordplay with his own eyes since his reincarnation. Deline smoothly dodged a lightning-fast thrust from his opponent, his expression remaining perfectly calm as if he had already seen through every single move. Although Dalton's sword strikes were fast, they still couldn't even touch the hem of his older brother's clothes, driving him more insane at the massive gap in their strength. Deline suddenly accelerated, creating bright golden streaks around his body, causing Dalton to gasp in shock because he couldn't keep up with that terrifying speed. But under Klein's special vision, he asserted that he could completely see through even the slightest movements of his older brother. He began to analyze each of Delane's magical footwork steps, where a golden flow of energy was enveloping the warrior's legs. Down to the exact moment he leaped off the ground with precision, creating gentle yet powerful shockwaves. Dalton gritted his teeth, yelling as he swung his wooden sword high, striving to deliver a finishing blow to reclaim his trampled honor. Klein coldly remarked that even the most subtle mana flow of the Rhineland family's secret art could not escape the tracking of the Necromancer tyrant. Deline delivered a powerful kick, creating a brilliant mana explosion that left his opponent completely defenseless. The match officially concluded as the genius of the Rhineland family stood proudly, declaring victory before the bewildered loser. He glanced over with a cold expression, reiterating his warning that it was the other man who would suffer in this confrontation. Below the stands, the spectators couldn't help but tremble in awe as they witnessed the legendary meteor sword technique with their own eyes. They whispered that this was an assertion of the authority of the main bloodline, while Klein only tiredly rubbed his eyes because the light just now was too blinding. Amidst the brilliant space of the main hall, a voice calling Klein's name broke the young man's silent atmosphere. Deline flashed a warm smile, walked toward his younger brother, and curiously asked how long he had been standing there watching the match. The blond young man scratched his head humbly, asserting that he would have pushed himself even harder had he known his brother was watching him. Standing before an older brother who was perfect in both appearance and personality, Klein secretly marveled at the god's favoritism and began to wonder about the presence of the branch families. He inwardly scoffed at how they had flocked there to beg for money just as Duke Heinkel appeared to praise Delaine's victory. Duke Heinkel Rhineland, the seventh-generation head of the family, spoke words of praise that Deline had mastered the family techniques at such a young age. While Deline excitedly rushed over to call his father, Klein could only stand silently observing the man who held the title of his father in this life. The Duke looked at his eldest son with eyes full of expectation and remarked that Deline must have trained incredibly hard to achieve the results he had now. To Heinkel, his genius son Deline seemed to be the last piece of pride he cherished amidst the decline of the lineage. Commander Dunkey also spared no words of praise, affirming that children of the same age wouldn't even dare to dream of the level of mana and precision that Deline possessed. Heinkel solemnly reminded him of the final instructions of the first-generation Duke Berkel Rhineland that a knight of this family must always be the most excellent warrior of the empire. In response to that expectation, Deline appeared extremely humble, saying that he still had a very long way ahead to truly perfect himself. The Duke asked his son to engrave those teachings into his heart to continuously move forward, causing Deline to hurriedly bow his head to express his deep gratitude. However, the atmosphere suddenly turned freezing cold when Heinkel unexpectedly shifted his gaze and called out the name of his youngest son Klein with a highly distant tone. Facing the pressuring gaze of his powerful father, Klein only remained silent with sharp eyes, secretly preparing his mindset for the variables that were about to arrive. The Duke's massive hand slowly reached out, placing itself on the silver hair of his youngest son with an invisible pressure. He coldly remarked that he did not feel any mana flow emanating from Klein's body. Klein could only bow his head to accept his father's disappointed apology, thinking to himself that when all expectations faded, he was nothing more than a worthless piece of trash. The commander standing behind spoke up to explain that the young master had missed the most important years of swordplay training while under house arrest in the monastery. Immediately, malicious whispers echoed throughout the hall about how the second child of the Rhineland house completely lacked any talent. The people from the side branches constantly insulted the direct line children as useless and asserted that it was now time for people like them to rise and take power. Ignoring the insults aimed at him, Klein suddenly recalled Berkel's gaze from the past and began to feel extreme contradiction. The image of that righteous knight returned along with the affirmation that all combat efforts were for the future of the generations to come. Klein's hands clenched so tightly that they trembled, his white knuckles showing the fury rising powerfully from the depths of his soul. He looked at the pompous trash before him with eyes full of murderous intent, silently cursing that he had once traded his very life for a decaying family like this. Klein quietly watched his father and brother's figures leaving along with a highly indifferent goodbye echoing from behind. Immediately, the young man named Dalton turned around to mock that it was ridiculous how the young master of the Rhineland house didn't even know how to hold a sword. He smirked mockingly that Klein was just a living disgrace relying on the title of the family's noble direct bloodline. Looking at Dalton's pompous face, Klein silently calculated and thought to himself that the guy was essentially just a side branch member and nothing more. He casually retorted, asking whether secretly tailing girls behind the ballroom was what made him feel proud of the lineage. Dalton asked in panic how he knew that secret, while Klein coldly mocked that he was truly naive to think money could shut the world's mouth. Without letting the opponent react in time, Klein unleashed a highly deceptive leg sweep, causing Dalton to completely lose his balance and collapse. He fell flat onto the floor in utter amazement, unable to believe he had been taken down so easily by someone considered useless. Dalton screamed bitterly that he was just trying to vent his anger on him after being defeated by Deline, and then began spewing terrible insults. But when he insulted him as a bastard child who didn't even know who his mother was, Klein abruptly stopped in his tracks with eyes burning with murderous intent and pressed him on the words just said. Dalton was so bewildered that he couldn't utter a word, cold sweat running down his forehead as he felt the invisible pressure from Klein's gaze. In his heart, Klein thought to himself that the mysterious mother was not the issue, but the delusional arrogance of the side-branch fools was what truly deserved contempt. He narrowed his eyes, looking deep into the harsh reality, wondering how an illustrious family could decay to such a low status today. The image of the hero of the past returned in his memory like an irony, making him feel deep sorrow for the legacy his old enemy had painstakingly built. Commander Dunkey intervened in time and demanded Dalton to stop this rude behavior immediately because enough was enough. The knight declared in a serious voice that any disrespectful behavior aimed at the young master would not be tolerated ever again. Dalton gritted his teeth in fury, though extremely resentful. He could only click his tongue and let it go while anger was still swirling in his chest. Before leaving, he still didn't forget to hurl insults at Klein as a coward who only knew how to hide behind a bodyguard to keep a bit of his pathetic dignity. Dunkey quietly observed Dalton's figure as he walked away while screaming, demanding him not to look at him in a highly ridiculous manner. He tightly gripped his sword hilt as an affirmation of his absolute loyalty and readiness to punish anyone who dared to violate the family's majesty. Klein narrowed his eyes in silence, his deep gaze concealing an intention that had just sparked after observing his older brother's match. He unexpectedly turned to ask Commander Dunkel whether he carried any spare swords with him at this very moment. The two quietly walked toward the empty clearing under the dark night, where only the faint moonlight illuminated the young master's poised figure. Dunkel quickly drew a sword to present it and affirmed that the young master's requests would always be met immediately. The knight showed confusion as he asked why he wanted to hold a weapon at such a late hour of the night. Klein slowly held the sword, his mind displaying the image of Delane's sword strike and wondering if he could replicate that meteor sword technique. He ordered Dunkel to go rest first because he still had a few things to confirm, causing the commander to inwardly realize that the young master had not yet given up his intention of pursuing the way of the sword. However, Dunkel thoughtfully left with the mindset that all efforts would be in vain since Klein's body naturally did not possess a single bit of mana. He believed that a person lacking mana could permanently never become a knight, let alone execute the sect-guarding secret technique created by the Duke himself. Standing alone in the windy wilderness, Klein tightly gripped the sword with a cold expression, understanding that merely copying the footwork while lacking mana would be an extremely harsh challenge. Klein silently closed his eyes, thinking to himself that the images of the recent match were returning with an unusually vivid clarity in his mind. He began to simulate each precise acceleration rhythm, the way his older brother stamped his foot onto the ground to generate lightning-fast propulsion, down to the flawless sword swing trajectory and even the subtle mana circulation method inside a genius's body. Klein's eyes suddenly flared with a highly magical purple hue, as dark lightning began to dance wildly around the Necromancer tyrant's pupils. In the distance, Commander Dunkel turned his head in shock as he sensed an earth-shattering energy explosion that had just erupted from the young master's direction. The knight stunnedly remarked that the aura enveloping the space carried a terrifying pressure never seen before. His eyes dilated in horror, his mind screaming that the reality unfolding before his eyes was a completely unbelievable thing. Amidst the energy storm, Klein forcefully swung the sword, creating a massive purple slash that tore the large boulder into 100 fragments in the blink of an eye. His gaze focused intensely on the point of impact of the technique, where dark magic was blending perfectly into each sharp sword strike. Standing tall amidst the soaring aura of death, Archimond in the form of the Rhineland House's young master officially marked the awakening of a forbidden power. After unleashing the terrifying strike that shattered the boulder, Klein silently stood among the ruins before the bewildered Commander Dunkel. The knight hurriedly ran over and stammered, asking whether the young master had just performed a completely unimaginable feat. Klein looked down at his hands with a highly skeptical face, inwardly asking himself what the hell was ultimately going on with this new body. The shocking incident caused the maid Erin, standing from afar, to also tremble out of fear for the abnormal developments happening to her master. Even a seasoned priest like Garrison had his expression change. He thoughtfully realized that a highly dangerous aura had just risen. Right after that, Klein was thrown into a brutal purification once again as his head was submerged in cold water to the point that it felt like he was about to suffocate. Garrison triumphantly remarked that he had improved by holding his breath for over a minute, while Aaron innocently praised that the young master could now dive as excellently as a fish. He emerged from the water, panting in extreme anger upon hearing the old priest joke about moving the next purification session to an actual aquarium. Klein grumpily pressed to ask why today's ritual lasted so long, causing Garrison to flash a mysterious smile and reveal that he had felt a chilling energy radiating from his room. The young man could only grit his teeth and endure the restraint of the guards, his heart filled with fury thinking that the old man had used that ridiculous reason to torture him the entire session. Commander Dunkel stepped forward and presented a letter, announcing that young Master Klein had just received an invitation from Lord Dalton. While drying his soaking wet hair, Klein asked who that was. The knight then explained it was the very person who had challenged Deline and wanted to apologize for the previous incident. Recalling the guy's face full of murderous intent earlier, he inwardly disdained and wondered why that bastard had suddenly acted so polite. The teenager slowly opened the letter, intently reading each line of words with a highly unpredictable expression. The letter mentioned an upcoming grand hunting festival, making Klein inwardly judge that the act of inviting him right after the brawl was highly suspicious. His gaze became sharp as he firmly asserted that this was merely a crude bait to lure him out of the mansion. Before Dunkel's question of whether he truly wanted to participate, he casually replied that he had no reason to refuse such an opportunity. Klein glanced at the old sword leaning against the corner of the wall, his mind beginning to calculate his next moves. He told himself that at least for the time being, he possessed a weapon powerful enough to rely on. By continuously reenacting Delane's swordplay in his head for many days, the necromancer tyrant suddenly realized a highly important key point. Klein realized he possessed the ability to perfectly copy any technique after witnessing it just a single time. Although the reason was not yet clear, this power helped him easily recreate the powerful attack he had seen from his older brother. Standing beside him, Commander Dunkel quietly observed with a gaze tinged with thoughtfulness regarding the young master's sudden change. After consideration, he approved the preparation of the carriage for the trip and wondered why Klein was suddenly interested in the grand hunting festival. Priest Garrison unexpectedly appeared and maliciously pressed to ask what Klein was ultimately plotting by wanting to join this journey. In response to that suspicion, the teenager only maintained an indifferent face and asserted that everything had been clearly explained by him beforehand. Garrison narrowed his eyes highly probingly. He admitted that he himself was having a highly terrible premonition about the developments that were about to happen. The carriage slowly rolled away from the magnificent castle, advancing into the trail amidst the gloomy old forest. The rotations of the wheels grinding on the rugged ground seemed to signal a highly turbulent future waiting ahead. Inside, Klein quietly crossed his arms, looking at Aaron who was feeling nauseous from motion sickness, secretly preparing his mindset to confront any traps of the enemy. Garrison reiterated that he had warned him not to go, while Klein coldly handed over the pillow and told him to use it. He further explained that the western forest terrain was inherently very rugged, and this journey would be extremely arduous without careful preparation. Seeing the young master lost in thought, the priest advised him in a low voice to catch some sleep so his body would soon feel recovered. But Klein immediately corrected him that the pillow was only for Aaron and mockingly told the old man to take care of himself first. Looking out the carriage window, he inwardly remarked that the scenery here had changed too much compared to what he once knew. Because in the past, this land was completely full of corpses and freezing snow, not at all prosperous like the current green field. Klein narrowed his eyes in deep thought, feeling that the fertility of a once frozen battlefield was a highly unusual thing. He inwardly judged that every mark in this place deeply reminded him of the figure of the hero Burkle. Dunkel suddenly called out to the young master to announce their arrival, bringing him back to a reality full of conspiracies. The magnificent mansion of the Cornwell family stood tall in the space, officially opening up new and highly arduous challenges. Klein stood silently before Dalton's mansion, inwardly assessing the residence of the one who had just provoked him on the training ground. He realized the luxury here even far exceeded that of the Rhineland main house, one of the three most illustrious grand families of the empire. Looking at the crowd partying lavishly, Klein thought to himself that they had spent a massive amount of money just to prepare for a children's hunting competition. Suddenly, the sound of his name being called forced the necromancer tyrant to immediately break away from his endless thoughts about this vanity. Dalton appeared alongside his ferocious hound pack and mockingly asked what Klein was so absorbed in calculating that he was dazed to that extent. He smirked triumphantly, declaring that this estate was built from the very spare change they had squeezed out of the Rhineland direct line. While caressing the growling hounds, Dalton ridiculed that 7 years of house arrest in the monastery had left him completely blind to how this world operates. Klein coldly replied with skepticism regarding since when a hunt had turned into such a grotesque social performance. Seeing that his opponent seemed impatient, Dalton clearly revealed his sinister side, affirming that he had prepared everything ready for the ceremony. He waved his hand highly arrogantly and demanded the young master to look closely at what was about to unfold before his eyes. Dalton led the ferocious hound pack, aggressively declaring the hunt officially started. He explained that he had scattered bait all over the mountain to arouse the beast's bloodthirsty instinct. The starved hounds, possessing a sense of smell hundreds of thousands of times sharper than a normal person's, were frantically dashing away. He drew his bow triumphantly, saying that once they caught the scent of food, the prey would have no way to escape. The alpha bared its fangs with glowing eyes, showing an extreme craving for flesh and blood. Arrows tore through the wind, piercing the hounds' bodies and causing them to writhe in pain deep in the forest. Dalton laughed arrogantly, affirming to his henchmen that this hunt was a complete success. Aaron ran over in a panic to check on the situation but only saw Dalton standing there with a face full of conspiracy. He reached out to pat Aaron's head and mockingly called her the little servant girl of that piece of trash Klein. He smirked, clearly revealing his sinister nature, wondering why Klein brought this burden along, then ordered her to follow him. Dalton grabbed the maid Aaron and announced that he had a special mission for her, leaving the little girl utterly bewildered. But immediately, his brutal arm was restrained by a powerful force, accompanied by a steely command demanding him to let go right away. Klein squeezed his opponent's wrist tightly with eyes full of murderous intent, threatening that if Dalton didn't want this arm broken, he had better behave. The side branch fellow let out a furious roar and tried to swing a fist at the young master to relieve the humiliation he was enduring. He frantically charged forward to attack and yelled demanding Klein not to act all high and mighty, while the teenager still maintained absolute calmness. Ignoring the chaos, Klein quickly placed his foot on the stirrup and mounted the horse with highly decisive movements. Dalton also spurred his horse away, not forgetting to look back with a sinister laugh and order Klein to quickly follow him. Before departing, he requested Commander Dunkel to stay behind to take care of Aaron and absolutely not follow, despite the knight's anxious warnings about the lurking danger. To prepare for the worst scenario, he secretly drew out an important item and handed it directly to Dunkel along with a highly meaningful look. That was a signal magic scroll, a type of single-use ancient tome that could be activated without mana to transmit information as soon as it was torn apart. Klein glanced toward the priest who was quietly following behind and told Dunkel that if the old man suddenly disappeared, it would definitely be a sign of danger. He raised his fist to show the commander an ancient crest, explaining that when the scroll was torn, the signal would be transmitted straight to his hand immediately. Klein spurred his horse, speeding away into the night, placing all his trust in Dunkel despite the knight's anxious calls echoing behind. The night sky was tinged with a dark purple hue as if silently signaling unexpected variables about to strike amidst the desolate forest. Standing silently in the darkness, Priest Garrison only maintained a highly unpredictable, stoic attitude as he witnessed the young master's figure gradually fade into the distance. The teenager leaned low on his horse, inwardly judging that the enemy was certainly not too far away and if he followed the tracks, he would soon find the truth. Suddenly, a cold voice rang out from the void, causing Klein to stop in his tracks, reproaching him that he had kept the other party waiting for far too long. Dalton was sitting perched beside the animal carcasses with a frantic demeanor. He licked the sharp, cold blade and asserted that he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Leaping down from his horse, Klein maintained a steely expression and pressed to ask what kind of bizarre farce this side branch fellow was ultimately putting on deep in the forest. His eyes narrowed in high vigilance as he observed the gruesome surroundings, inwardly wondering what the true purpose hidden behind this bastard's actions was. Looking at the animal carcasses scattered all over the ground, Dalton triumphantly declared that this was the prelude to the glorious conclusion of today's hunt. He pointed his sword tip directly at Klein and asserted that he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time to execute his final plan. His face distorted with excitement as he growled, stating that the real prey he wanted to finish off was none other than him. He aggressively declared that he would chop off his head to present it at Delane's feet as a celebratory gift for the downfall of the direct bloodline, while constantly insulting the Rhineland family as nothing but a pathetic bunch and considering Klein an empty piece of trash with no purpose in life. With an arrogant wave of his hand, the side branch fellow firmly asserted that Klein would not have even the slightest chance to swing a sword in retaliation. His henchmen revealed themselves all at once with weapons in hand, loudly asserting that the title of Duke should inherently belong to their faction. Dalton coldly ordered the archers to prepare to unleash their arrows and told him to blame his own fate for being born into such a decaying family. Faced with the pressuring silence of the young master, he continued to add bitter words about a dark future that was about to strike. He laughed crazily and declared that starting tomorrow, the entire world would only talk about the destruction of the illustrious Northern Swordsman clan. Dalton mocked and asserted that the young master of the Rhineland house would ultimately end his life as food for the hounds. Amidst all that, Burkel's old oath about sacrificing for the future of the children suddenly returned like a highly bitter irony. Instead of being afraid, Klein burst into a contemptuous laugh at the cowardly threats of the opponent standing right in front of him. He covered his face with his hand and laughed out loud in a crazy manner, letting a dark murderous aura begin to spread and envelop the entire surrounding space. Dalton asked in bewilderment what he was laughing at and whether the young master's brain had truly gone mad. Klein paused in silence for a beat, then lowered his voice, saying that in reality, it was arrogant fools like them who did not know their own limitations. The silhouette of the tyrant Archimond appeared, overlapping with Klein in his glowing red eyes, radiating a terrifying pressure. Dalton was so stunned that he was motionless, cold sweat running down as he realized he was facing an entity far beyond his comprehension. Klein stared straight at his opponent and asserted that the existence of this family was inherently built at the exact cost of his life. Yet now, pieces of trash dared to mock and spit upon that noble title, causing his fury to erupt to the absolute maximum. Klein stood tall in the center of the energy storm, as a blue aura began to swirl fiercely and threateningly around his body, causing Dalton to scream in terror that this could not be magic since the opponent's body naturally lacked mana, but he only coldly replied that it was not ordinary magic. The teenager revealed that the rising power was the purest demonic aura, the brutal energy that once belonged to the Necromancer tyrant. Dalton's henchmen frantically defended against the soul storm and trembled, wondering who the person standing before them ultimately was. Klein's gaze glowed horrifyingly, causing Dalton to suddenly realize the terrifying truth about the dark demonic aura that was gradually swallowing his sanity. With a sinister smile, he began chanting to call upon the ancient souls buried deep within the flow of time. Klein floated in midair, boldly declaring that he would drag all the demons out into the light and once again ordered them to obey his commands. The deep blue demonic aura spread across the space along with a highly brutal command to begin the banquet and devour everything in their path. Flaming blue skulls materialized from the void, ready to plunge into the slaughter to satisfy the soul thirst suppressed for 2 centuries. Dalton widened his eyes in utter despair, gasping in shock that this was impossible, seemingly realizing the true identity of the one named Archimond. Dalton stuttered Archimond's name in shock upon witnessing a horde of undead rise from the ground, carrying towering resentment. Amidst the encirclement of the demons, Klein with his glowing blue eyes coldly ordered them to slaughter everyone in their way. Hundreds of skeletons flaming with blue fire frantically charged forward like bloodthirsty wraiths, signaling a horrific massacre about to take place. The sky turned as crimson red as blood, signaling the appearance of an evil entity that had crossed beyond the boundary of life and death. Klein's bloodshot eye flashed in the night, like an evil mark carrying power that could destroy everything. Looking at the dark energy streams pouring from his hands, he emotionally felt the highly nostalgic familiarity of the power that had once been tied to his life. He opened his arms to welcome the surging dark power, feeling each stream of mana vibrating fiercely within his veins. Memories from 200 years ago rushed back, where he stood amidst a sea of blood and corpses as the most notorious tyrant in history. The souls groaned and screamed in the darkness, echoing continuously in the space as if waiting for a command to break their shackles. Dalton was in absolute terror. He screamed out in despair that this was impossible and refused to believe that the tyrant Archimond had truly resurrected. Dalton stuttered in horror as he called out Archimond's name, his initial arrogance now completely replaced by ultimate dread. Upon witnessing a succession of dried bone undead frantically bursting out from the ground under the command of an entity with overwhelming power, Klein smiled highly maliciously and ordered the Legion of Hell to slaughter everyone blocking the path, sparing absolutely no one. Skeletal warriors with dead, glowing orange eyes stood ready to obey, signaling a bloody purge about to take place. He smirked triumphantly, affirming to Dalton that Archimond was indeed the great title the world used to call him. Dalton's subordinates began to tremble in dread, unable to believe that a terrifying fairy tale was manifesting right before their eyes. Looking at the surrounding undead legion, a henchman turned pale and stuttered, wondering what the hell these things ultimately were. Meanwhile, another tried to act tough with a forced laugh, reassuring himself that this was probably just a cheap scare tactic by Klein. He mocked that the young master of the Rhineland house had gone through the trouble of putting on a grand theatrical performance but ultimately only summoned a pile of garbage. Hearing that mockery, Klein narrowed his eyes with murderous intent, repeating the word garbage in a freezing tone that signaled the death of the one who had just misplaced his words. Dalton and his henchmen bewilderedly uttered the name Archimond upon seeing the army of dried bones standing tall behind the young master's back. In response to that panic, Klein curled his lips into a highly evil smile and raised his hand to order the horde of undead to destroy all of them. Despite facing overwhelming numbers, the side branch henchmen suddenly burst into a triumphant laugh, considering this a fantastic opportunity. Dalton quickly regained his confidence, smirking as he ordered his subordinates to clean up this pile of obstructing bones first. He continued to loudly urge the remaining men to quickly form a vanguard, opening a bloody path straight ahead. Responding to that command, the long-range attack unit immediately locked Klein in their sights while he still stood proudly before the horde of undead. Under the tense atmosphere, a mercenary gritted his teeth and squeezed the crossbow trigger, concentrating intensely to prepare for the ambush. The command to fire rang out sharply, followed by a succession of arrows tearing through the wind at lightning speed, creating a storm of death pouring down on the target. The image of countless sharp arrows waiting to pin into his flesh was vividly reflected in Klein's serene eyes right before the moment of impact. But with extraordinary agility, the teenager merely leaned his body slightly backward, smoothly evading the entire attack in a highly leisurely manner. Dalton laughed triumphantly among his subordinates, believing that Klein must now be riddled with arrows like a pitiful porcupine. But that smile suddenly vanished when he shockingly realized a bizarre transformation was taking place right before his eyes. All the fatal arrows were blocked by dark shields that suddenly materialized from the void. From within the black smoke, a legion of white skeletons with flaming eyes gradually emerged, standing guard around the young man with absolute authority. Klein smirked sarcastically, remarking that 200 years was indeed a long time, seeing as no one could recognize the presence of these legendary skeletons anymore. The mercenaries began to tremble and scream in panic when they saw the skeletons, which originally had nothing, suddenly equipped with steel shields in the blink of an eye. He calmly responded to the enemy's fear by asserting that if these people thought they were just ordinary skeletons, they were completely wrong. His eyes flashed with a dangerous light, emphasizing that his warriors possessed a completely different level of power and class. Dalton was so stunned that his pupils contracted in terror, feeling as if the Grim Reaper was choking the breath out of him when facing the terrifying entity. As if sending a challenge to the ancestor Burkle, he coldly ordered the first unit to advance and completely crush the enemy's defensive formation. Klein coldly ordered the Hell Legion to crush them, for that was the price to pay for insulting the future of the Rhineland lineage. His sharp gaze and arrogant smile made the self-proclaimed elders tremble as they recognized the majesty of a sovereign. The moment the command was finished, hundreds of skeletons flaming with blue fire, like a pack of wild beasts released from their cage, frantically charged straight ahead at a terrifying speed. Dalton's mercenaries screamed in panic upon realizing they were surrounded, but the leader stubbornly demanded everyone to hold the line. Those in the vanguard rushed to attack but were immediately and brutally torn apart by the undead, their blood-curdling screams echoing throughout the forest. Fresh blood dyed the ground red, as fatal slashes from the dried bone army continuously poured down, shattering the enemy's defensive line in the blink of an eye. Dalton witnessed the horrific scene unfolding in shock, stuttering curses in absolute despair and ultimate dread. Unable to believe his eyes, he trembled and wondered how these damn things could possibly possess such superior strength and speed. The undead continuously charged forward with ultimate savagery, using every means from tearing to slashing to exterminate every living being before them. Amidst the ultimate chaos, the leader still tried to scream commands for the archer unit to flank behind and encircle, searching for a fragile chance to counterattack. Following the commander's order, the side branch archers took their positions on the high tree branches, pointing dozens of cold crossbows straight at the opponent. The undead army maintained its formation coldly, raising their crossbows ready to fight under the command of the tyrant Archimond. The mercenary was stunned to notice the appearance of an archer unit within the enemy ranks and frantically demanded his comrades to quickly find cover. Klein coldly gave the command to fire, triggering a bloody storm of arrows to pour down on the heads of those who had dared to mock his prestige. A succession of pitch-black arrows tore through space, carrying cold death energy aimed straight at the enemy's chaotic formation. The ill-fated arrows pierced through the mercenaries' bodies, leaving them with no time to react as they collapsed in ultimate agony. Piteous screams echoed across the battlefield as countless arrows pinned tightly into flesh, creating a haunting scene of slaughter. Dalton witnessed his army being taken down easily in shock, desperately realizing the terrifying power of the skeletons he had once despised. Noticing the approaching collapse, he roared in dread, unable to believe that the undead legion before his eyes could carry such massive destructive power. Knowing that trying to hold on was futile, Dalton hurriedly drew his sword and screamed commands for the survivors to switch to close combat to find a path to survival. Seeing his soldier retreating in panic, Dalton roared in a furious frenzy, asking if they were deaf for refusing to step forward and attack. He rushed over and grabbed a subordinate's shirt, his face contorted in rage as he called them all a bunch of cowardly bastards who only knew how to run from decaying bones. Despite the weak resistance, he frantically swung his sword, slashing relentlessly at the dried bone wraiths and loudly insulting them as nothing but a pack of deformed monstrosities. Dalton smirked triumphantly when his attack seemed to decapitate an undead, thinking he had found the enemy's weakness. But in the very next moment, as the skull dropped onto the grass, he realized the horrific truth that the skeleton was not destroyed as he had thought. That headless entity still continued to move agilely, picking up its own skull to the utter amazement of the mercenaries. Klein observed from afar, flashing a cold smile and explaining that this was exactly what normal people always mistakenly assumed about his army. The teenager reminded the opponent that he had warned them about the difference between ordinary skeletons and the Legion of Hell, and once again affirmed that his loyal henchmen were not something that could be easily defeated simply by decapitation. The undead automatically began to reassemble their shattered bone joints, the recently dropped skull perfectly locked back into its old position by a skeletal hand. Archimond affirmed that the immortality of the dried bone army was the key that allowed him to once sweep through and dominate the entire continent, leaving Dalton terrified as he saw the undead head reattach itself and realized the demonic aura prevented them from being easily finished off. The skeletons bearing glowing orange eyes possessed absolute obedience and executed masterful military tactics. Dalton's mercenaries began to panic, gritting their teeth and trembling before creatures far beyond their comprehension, causing the leader to scream in despair, asking why these monstrosities could not be killed. Klein calmly smirked, inwardly judging that his current body's summoning limit was capped at the number 11. The survivors began to flee in terror, looking at each other in utter panic and wanting to immediately end this slaughter. Arrogant laughter echoed across the dark night sky like a mockery directed at the side branch fool's stupidity. At the peaceful mansion, rumors began to break out by the fountain regarding whether young Master Klein had truly taken action. Garrison casually confirmed everything to Aaron and began to flip through the haunting memory pages of the time Klein was still in the monastery. Aaron burst out laughing and said that just imagining it was ridiculous, while Garrison maintained a highly incomprehensible, stoic expression. The priest smiled gently, then remarked that Aaron truly loved and cared for her young master very much. The little maid munched on food with a highly proud face, beginning to talk endlessly about just how wonderful young Master Klein truly was. In stark contrast, at the bloody battlefield, the enemy was kneeling flat and desperately begging him to stop this slaughter. The mercenary wept piteously, both trembling and muttering about Klein's mercy while death drew closer than ever. Aaron blurted out that he was an incredibly sweet person. Right at the moment an undead's blade sliced down the opponent's body with a brutal slash. She excitedly recounted the time she was gifted a cookie by the young master, amidst dark-colored blood continuously splashing through the night. With shining eyes full of adoration, Aaron boldly asserted that Klein was indeed the kindest and gentlest person in this world. Klein quietly raised his hand forward, letting the crimson blood droplets splash onto the cold, emotionless face of a tyrant. The undead legion continued to deliver brutal killing blows, turning the forest into a living hell overflowing with desperate screams. Dalton screamed, asking if the opponent was deaf upon seeing the undead horde still toweringly marching forward despite all threats. He gritted his teeth and cursed the bastards, frantically swinging his sword to relieve the terror surging in his chest. He roared, calling the undead a pack of skeletal monstrosities, then delivered a furious slash tearing through the thick fog. An undead was decapitated amidst the chaotic brawl, making the mercenaries think they had seemingly found the hope to extinguish the Hell Legion. Dalton cheered triumphantly that he had caught the weakness and asserted that decapitation was the only way to finish them off. However, a skeletal shadow from behind unexpectedly swung a death scythe in a counterattack, turning the tide in the blink of an eye. The leader was stunned upon realizing that entity still continued to fight even though its head had left its neck, leaving him bewildered by their immortality. In his desperation, Dalton screamed that the game with the corpses was over and as long as Klein fell, all these souls would vanish. He poured all his strength into charging straight toward the young master with a fatal slash, his death-demanding shout echoing throughout the old forest. Facing the desperate attack, Klein's eyes flared with a highly mystical purple hue, he slightly smirked and gave a cold signal marking the end for the arrogant fellow. Klein illuminated his mystical purple eyes, telling himself that he was now able to completely see through every law of movement. He borrowed the power of that divine eye to tightly grip the sword hilt, compressing the entire dark aura into a single faded slash. Just by memorizing the techniques he had once witnessed, this tyrant could perfectly replicate any peak move, leaving Dalton to realize in horror that the movements of the Rhineland family's secret art were manifesting right before his eyes in an unimaginable way. Klein swung his sword, creating a massive purple streak of light that tore through space, executing the meteor sword technique with an utterly overwhelming power. Fresh blood splashed as the steel blade pierced through Dalton's body, accompanied by a cold threat that he should not dare to expect a peaceful death. With eyes burning with a highly horrifying demonic aura, he affirmed that the true punishment for the arrogant fool was only officially beginning now. The final sword strike carved a deep groove into the dark night, leaving behind deathly echoes vibrating throughout the desolate old forest. Dalton lay collapsed in a pool of blood while Klein stood silently looking at the defeated man, coldly admitting that his previous judgment was completely accurate. He silently reminisced about the moment Archimond was once finished off because he could not overcome the fatal weakness when the summoning sorcerer fell. The dark power of the tyrant Archimond burned fiercely on his hands, radiating a potent deep blue demonic aura. Those hands tightly gripped the sword hilt as if holding the destiny of an entire empire in a vortex of hatred. He suddenly remembered the blood-stained memory fragments and wondered if the power of the Rhineland family was truly what was protecting this clan. Dalton lay gasping for breath in a pool of blood, bewilderedly asking why the young man could utter such bizarre words. He continued to question in despair, but his breathing had begun to falter due to the fatal wounds. His vision blurred and then completely sank into darkness, leaving a terrifying silence enveloping the battlefield. Looking down at the defeated enemy, Klein silently repeated the name Burkle as a challenge sent to the ancestor who was once his sworn enemy. With a cold expression, he declared that he would personally fix the rot of this family that was standing on the verge of collapse. However, reality suddenly inverted, causing him to wake up in extreme panic and wonder where he currently was. The surrounding space was suffocatingly dark, where his hands were tightly chained to a cold wooden board. A cold iron shackle suddenly locked tightly around his ankle, ending any chance of escape for the one lying in the darkness. Meanwhile, Dalton was shocked to find himself chained to a chair full of sharp spikes, with an indescribable chilling sensation spreading throughout his body. Klein slowly appeared before him and coldly announced that this special guest had finally awakened. He began to explain this land of souls, a place he called Archimond's underworld reserved strictly for sinners. Dalton tremblingly asked if this was truly the afterlife created by the tyrant of the past. Klein continued to expose his beastly past, recalling how he had ruthlessly tortured his loyal hunting dogs over the years, when all his barbaric killings were justified under the guise of hunting by the snobbish aristocratic class. He asserted that he had never forgotten Dalton's triumphant expression whenever he satisfied his own murderous instincts. Dalton furiously shouted, demanding him to stop making up baseless lies, and threatened to make him regret it if he wasn't released immediately. However, he suddenly froze, his eyes widening in doubt as he began to realize his true position in this dark place. Dalton shockingly realized that Klein's slash should have taken his life, but he still couldn't understand why he could still feel reality. He tremblingly wondered how he was still intact after that terrifying attack while being tightly chained. Klein coldly affirmed that Dalton was actually dead and this was merely the time for him to pay back all the karma he had caused in his previous life. Dalton screamed in despair, demanding that he stop the nonsense about Archimond or the afterlife and release him immediately. Despite that resistance, Klein radiated a dark blue demonic aura and declared that whether he believed it or not no longer mattered. He stood proudly among the ferocious spirit hounds, asserting that the moment for him to atone for his heinous crimes had truly arrived. Dalton was so stunned that he became speechless upon witnessing the horrifying scene gradually becoming clear in the pitch-black darkness. Klein ordered him to listen closely to the growls of the demons waiting to devour his soul. He reiterated that these were the victims whose lives he had ruthlessly taken, and now they would make him experience the exact same pain. Amidst the heart-rending screams, he demanded that he engrave this excruciating pain into his core until his soul completely dissipated. Dalton screamed in despair as his breath was gradually choked by the extreme agony tormenting his body. Belated tears began to roll down the blood-stained face of the sinner who was nearing death's door. He lay there with wide, lifeless eyes, completely broken before the unshakable, overwhelming power of the young tyrant. Klein stood quietly from a distance observing the demise of his enemy, his cold eyes not showing the slightest hint of mercy. His face maintained a terrifying calmness, as if the life he just took was merely a trivial speck of dust in the flow of history. Despite the chilling presence of the white skeleton legion behind him, the young man still exuded the majestic demeanor of a monarch. He slowly raised his hand, which was burning with a dark blue demonic aura, and declared he would bestow a worthy reward upon the one who had just helped him. With the intention of freeing the soul from the dark chains, Klein cast a secret art to break the curse that was eternally imprisoning the white skeleton warrior. The brilliant soul light particles began to dissipate into the air, marking the dark entity's freedom after centuries of servitude. The young man stood alone in the silent night, quietly watching the final motes of light slowly fading away into the void. Klein softly suppressed a sigh as he witnessed the last remnants of the soul vanishing into the vast emptiness. Looking at the corpses scattered across the ground, he questioned himself about the meaning of death and the true purpose of being reincarnated once more. But that train of thought was suddenly interrupted by a stranger in a black cloak, who expressed surprise at seeing him use such a masterful forbidden art. Fearing his secret was completely exposed, Klein whipped around with a sharp gaze and interrogated the mysterious figure standing behind him about his true identity. In response to that vigilance was only a cryptic smile and an assertion that the Rhineland youth did not need to know who he was just yet. Shortly after, a bizarre green magical energy began to envelop the deceased's body, signaling an impending horrific event. The mysterious figure standing amidst the battlefield coldly declared that even if he explained, he would never be able to comprehend the truth of this reality. Suddenly, the eyes of the already cold corpses snapped open, burning with a chillingly dark light. The zombies began to rise from the dead, screaming in the darkness under the manipulation of the terrifying entity holding the energy orb. Klein shockingly realized that it was the resurrection arts, the ultimate technique to dominate the dead, and ceaselessly doubted the stranger's background. The mysterious figure flashed a devious smile, silently assessing that although Dalton had failed, this pile of corpses still had a lot of exploitative value. His maniacal laughter echoed throughout the frigid snowy mountains like an omen of a massacre that was about to begin. In another place, Aaron excitedly called out, asking Sir Dunkel to listen to some scary stories about their young master's childhood. But the knight merely replied restlessly that he would listen later, his eyes never leaving a piece of paper filled with abnormal signs. Dunkel tightly gripped the magic scroll in his hand and couldn't stop wondering why Klein had to resort to using this emergency item. He started sweating profusely as he realized 3 hours had passed since the young master went into the forest with Dalton and was still unheard from. Unable to be patient any longer, Dunkel was about to jump on his horse to find the young master when he was suddenly blocked by a group of soldiers. The soldiers stopped him from leaving on the grounds that the hunt was still ongoing and requested him to hold his position for a while longer. The knight's gaze suddenly turned sharp and cold. He silently observed the opponent as an extreme suspicion surged within him. Dunkel immediately recognized the Cornwell family crest on the opponent's armor and understood that these were Dalton's close henchmen. Dunkel affirmed his position as the captain of the Rhineland Knights and declared he would not stand idly by if these soldiers continued to block the way. He exuded a terrifying pressure through his sharp gaze and coldly asked if they had understood his threat yet. Facing the chilling murderous intent of the knight, the Cornwell family's henchmen could only stand rooted to the spot and tremblingly swallow their saliva in terror. He turned to instruct Aaron that he sensed something wrong and would immediately set out to find the young master right now. Dunkel requested her to return to the mansion first with Priest Garrison to ensure her safety amidst the perilous situation. However, Aaron shockingly informed him that the priest had left a long time ago with an extremely serious expression without saying a word. Hearing that, he was stunned, recalling Klein's instruction that if the old priest suddenly disappeared, it was a sign of danger. Understanding that time was running out, the knight immediately mounted his horse and gritted his teeth, cursing this malicious coincidence. Firmly believing the young master was in danger, Dunkel decided to tear the signal magic scroll to activate the emergency magic signal. He spurred his horse, dashing at wind-tearing speed through the night, secretly praying in his heart that he would arrive in time to save the young master. Klein faced the mysterious figure and the ferocious undead legion alone, creating a highly precarious situation. Deep down, he secretly worried as all his demonic aura had been depleted after the previous battle, making him unable to cast necromancy right now. Tense drops of sweat rolled down the Rhineland young master's face as he clearly felt his body's exhaustion reaching its limit. The cloaked figure pointed his finger, ordering the zombies to charge forward, for he knew that his current body couldn't hold out much longer either. The dead mercenaries charged forward madly under their new master's command to bury the young man's life. Facing the danger, he slightly clenched his fists and mocked the opponent for daring to use the mediocre resurrection arts to confront him. Suddenly, the crescent moon sigil on his hand glowed brightly, signaling the intervention from the previously activated magic scroll. The undead screamed terrifyingly in the darkness, ready to tear their prey apart despite the strange transformation of the surrounding space. With his glowing purple eyes full of arrogance, Klein smirked and declared that the end of the opponent's life had officially arrived. His extreme confidence left the dark mage stunned and bewildered, unable to believe what he was seeing. A brilliant golden pillar of light suddenly struck down from the sky, tearing through the dark night and suppressing all the dark energy in the forest. Priest Garrison appeared with absolute authority, using a massive purifying power to wipe out the zombies surrounding the young master. With a face glowing with divine power, he voiced a plea for the holy light to execute the punishing will of the gods. He prayed for the manipulated souls to soon find deliverance and eternal peace after their days of torment. Standing tall in the middle of the battlefield, Garrison asserted that Klein could now rest because all danger was under his control. The dark mage was shocked by the stranger's intervention and tremblingly asked who exactly the person standing before him was. The old man smirked with an arrogant expression, preparing to launch the final finishing blow to end the enemy's arrogance. He coldly declared that his presence here was the most resolute answer to all the chaos. Garrison was an exarch, one of the three most powerful artificial weapons of the church, one who swore to eradicate all seeds of disaster. That was the ultimate fighting force of the religious order, entities possessing terrifying power that could shake the entire continent. Garrison manifested as a mighty holy armament, his towering shadow enveloping the entire space. He unleashed a giant golden pillar of light with the power equivalent to an entire fortress, wiping out all obstacles in the blink of an eye. The dark mage screamed in agony as the brilliant holy aura began to scorch his flesh and shatter his barrier. The terrifying shockwave from the attack tore the ground apart, knocking back all the zombies waiting to devour their prey. The mage tremblingly stared at the priest in absolute shock upon realizing the entity he was facing. Klein stood quietly observing and silently evaluated the man known as the one possessing the strongest physical power on the continent. In response to that terror, Garrison smiled arrogantly and affirmed that his presence was absolute protection. Beneath their feet, the blood-stained corpses continued to growl unceasingly and approached with heavy, chilling sounds. The zombie legion besieged them madly from all sides, creating a dramatic life-and-death battle between light and darkness. They gaped their rotting mouths and screamed furiously as if to tear apart the hindrance of the holy energy source. Garrison grabbed a zombie's head and began to crush it with a deeply coercive, blazing golden holy aura. He swung his arm, creating a massive energy arc that swept through the undead legion, simultaneously demanding the sinner to listen to the oracle. With radiantly blazing eyes, the priest coldly ordered them to kneel, pray, and beg for forgiveness. As consecutive blades of light struck down, he declared he would bestow a baptism of sacred fire to end this filthy existence. The zombies were torn apart in the blink of an eye as he asserted this purification was to cleanse all the sins they had carried. Garrison stomped his foot heavily onto the ground, focusing all of his terrifying physical strength into a shockwave that shattered the surrounding space. The ground cracked open under the immense weight, creating an earth-shattering mana explosion that buried all seeds of darkness. The priest frantically swept through the zombies, swinging fists clad in holy aura to smash the rotting bodies with an unstoppable force. The enemy's blood splattered onto Garrison's scarred face as he declared this was the final judgment for those who dared to blaspheme. The dark mage witnessed the horrifying scene and trembled entirely, unable to fathom why an exarch of the church was present in this place. Amidst the field scattered with recently purged corpses, the dark mage stood stunned in terror as he felt the absolute pressure from the butcher priest. He gritted his teeth, cursing in sheer panic because the initial intelligence was completely wrong compared to the actual strength of his opponent. Not daring to look back, the defeated one hastily used all his remaining strength to flee from the dark forest in search of a fragile path to survival. In his stumbling, the mask hiding his identity suddenly fell to the ground, signaling the complete collapse of a dark conspiracy. However, a massive shadow suddenly closed in from behind, accompanied by a threatening question of where he thought he could go at a time like this. Garrison coldly crushed the enemy's head, ignoring the heart-wrenching, agonizing screams echoing through the dark space. The priest leaned his blood-stained face close and stated that the prayer was not yet over, so he should prepare himself mentally to be grateful for this judgment. The mage's pupils dilated in extreme despair upon realizing he no longer had any chance to resist death. A pillar of divine light erupted violently in the name of the light to crush the sinner into dust in a bloody purge. Klein stood silently observing the entire horrific scene, his eyes harboring an unpredictable contemplation about the terrifying power of this strange ally. A blood-stained eye rolled at the priest's feet as a testament to the brutality of the purification that had just ended. Garrison slowly lowered his voice to call young Master Klein's name while he maintained a pensive expression amidst the scattered corpses. He was secretly astonished upon realizing the old man had only taken one step forward and swung his arm a single time. But just that much, the pressure from his presence and the gust of wind from his punch was enough to completely turn the tide. Over 20 zombie corpses had been crushed on the spot, making Klein wary of this entity's absolute power. Garrison's fresh blood-stained hand reached out in the darkness like a reminder of the battlefield's cruel reality. He explained that he had rushed over immediately upon sensing the aura of necromancy rising strongly. With a cryptic smile, he softly muttered about the strangeness he had just detected in the atmosphere thick with magical power. Garrison suddenly placed his bloody hand on Klein's shoulder and began to interrogate him about the aura he had sensed earlier. The priest narrowed his eyes suspiciously, asserting that the dark mana did not seem to belong to the one he had just destroyed. Klein secretly cursed the freakish priest as he felt the heavy murderous intent surrounding him. He realized that with just one small slip, Garrison's bloody hand would immediately end his life right there. The tense atmosphere was suddenly broken when from afar, a horse's neigh echoed, signaling the arrival of Knight Dunkel. Dunkel hurriedly jumped off his horse with an extremely worried expression and constantly asked about the young master's current condition. Klein looked up at the loyal guard with dull eyes, then softly called his name in extreme exhaustion. Suddenly, fresh blood poured from the corner of his mouth, making him bitterly realize this body was still not strong enough to bear the forbidden art of necromancy. Dunkel screamed in terror seeing the Rhineland young master suddenly collapse right before his eyes. The knight ran desperately toward Klein to catch the frail body lying gasping on the battlefield in time. He shockingly asked about the source of this pool of blood, while Klein weakly requested him to stay quiet because his legs had completely lost sensation. Faced with Dunkel's anxious question about Dalton's whereabouts, the young man only kept silent as his consciousness began to sink into illusion. White petals stained with fresh blood acted as a testament to Klein's cold confession that he himself had ended Dalton's life. The reason was that he had plotted to assassinate him first, right on the magnificent Rhineland family territory under the witness of the blue sky. A furious slam on the table rang out, tearing through the silent atmosphere as the firm accusations were just uttered. Count Delcan of the Cornwell family screamed in madness, unable to believe his son was being branded a murderer. Amidst the solemn trial council, he constantly touted Dalton's honor and loyalty in order to turn his death into a wrongful tragedy. He aggressively demanded everyone to focus on finding the real culprit instead of baselessly pinning all the blame on his son. However, the atmosphere suddenly dropped when an official presented the interrogation report, affirming Klein had never changed his testimony despite intense questioning. He held up evidence showing Dalton had secretly mobilized over 20 private mercenaries, an undeniably shady act. Delcan turned pale with fright, secretly cursing his son for being a fool who left behind a disastrous paper trail that backed him into a corner. Despite the clear evidence, he still stubbornly screamed that this was absurd, because someone who had never held a sword like Klein couldn't possibly take down a talented knight. Those present constantly whispered and gossiped about how Klein, who originally had no mana at all, could possibly defeat Knight Dalton. Count Delcan sweated profusely, clearly realizing that if the plot to assassinate the main bloodline was exposed, his entire family would collapse. He smirked deviously and decided to turn the tables by attacking the young man's scandalous background. From the rumors about his late mother to the fact that Klein always claimed to be the tyrant Archimond since childhood were all dragged out by him as a shield. Delcan screamed furiously before the council, questioning why everyone would believe a madman's words to accuse his son. He became even more enraged when falsely accusing Klein of hiring people to assassinate Dalton and then shifting the blame, but a shout demanding him to stop rang out. Count Cornwell startled in terror, looking back toward the door with an ominous premonition about the owner of the voice that just cut him off. Klein calmly stepped into the grand hall with an arrogant demeanor. He subtly mocked that he was very impressed by the old man's endless nonsensical words. With a cold, sharp gaze, he asserted that Dalton had hired mercenaries to kill him and he was merely acting in self-defense with the support of Priest Garrison. Faced with Delcan's screams accusing him of lying, the young man only calmly asked back with a defiant attitude. Klein smirked deviously with glowing pink eyes, secretly admitting that the identity of the tyrant Archimond was not some baseless nonsense. Standing before Delcan's pale, bewildered face, he coldly reiterated the ironclad oath made right after ending Dalton's life. With a gaze burning with ambition, the young master of the Rhineland family asserted that he would personally restore the family's glory and not let the parasites continue to manipulate it. While he was harboring the intention to punish the branch families, a loud knock on the door suddenly shattered the tense atmosphere. An elegant aura flooded into the hall along with an apology for the delay from an uninvited guest. That was Leia, the female commander of the Blue Holy Spear Knights, who appeared with a gorgeous appearance and absolute authority. Klein glanced over with vigilance and secretly wondered why this woman was interfering in his family's hearing. Amidst the astonishment of the officials, the council representative declared that this matter did not fall under the Fallwyvern family's jurisdiction. However, Duke Heinkel had officially permitted her to attend because Dalton had a long-standing secret connection with Leia's Knight Order. As the holder of the deceased's past secrets, the haughty female commander officially stepped into the arduous legal battle. Leia narrowed her sharp eyes scrutinizingly, as if wanting to see through the other person's heart right from the first glance. She waved her hand meaningfully upon realizing their eyes had met and proposed a surprising request to the council. Leia declared she wanted a private conversation with Klein, leaving the young man completely stunned by this sudden intervention. Duke Heinkel appeared cold and approved the request on the condition that the meeting be kept very brief to not waste time. His father urged Klein to leave quickly, while he himself had not yet recovered from the shock of the unpredictable developments surrounding him. Klein slightly turned his head with a frowning face, secretly cursing the annoyance as he always seemed to have a troublesome destiny with knights. However, he immediately paused to reflect and realized this was a great opportunity to probe the true intentions of this powerful woman. He calculated that her calling him out privately was surely meant to confirm a truth, interrogate a secret, or test his true capabilities. With a resolute face, Klein replied to his father and decisively walked away to face the new variables waiting behind the door. No matter what Leia's purpose was, he affirmed that once he had chosen this path, he would never intend to back down before anyone. Klein secretly plotted to use the Fallwyvern family and other forces for his own plan as he stepped before the doors of justice. The sound of Leia's decisive footsteps echoed throughout the corridor, every step exuding the authority of a seasoned female commander. She pursed her lips mysteriously, keeping silent as a way to exert psychological pressure on the young man walking beside her. Suddenly, Leia walked faster and boldly closed the distance, making the atmosphere suddenly suffocating. She leaned in close, looked straight into Klein's eyes, and proposed to touch him, making the young man sweat profusely in astonishment. Facing this overwhelmingly proactive attitude, Klein gritted his teeth and wondered if he was dreaming when facing the strong woman's breath right beside him. That was Leia Ren Fallwyvern, a grand master of spearmanship who always appeared with a powerful blue holy spear on the battlefield. As the eldest daughter of one of the continent's three great families, she held the supreme commander position and possessed a weapon with ultimate icy power. Leia's glorious feats were marked by wiping out the ferocious orc monsters growling to devour humans alive. Facing the giants wielding battle axes, the female commander still maintained a relaxed demeanor, ready to unleash fatal spear strikes to execute justice. Leia's sharp eyes suddenly flashed a brilliant blue light, signaling the start of a lightning-fast sweep. A spear strike carrying holy power tore the monster's face apart, leaving it only enough time to let out an agonized scream before completely collapsing. During the monster suppression campaign in the West Forest, the female commander ventured alone into the most dangerous place to ensure the people's safety. She proved her overwhelming strength by single-handedly destroying a high-tier entity, leaving the entire Knight Order in absolute shock. Standing amidst a battlefield stained with the monster's green blood, Leia manifested as an undefeated god of war with the holy spear in her hand. That illustrious feat forged a renowned title for the Fallwyvern family's eldest daughter, one of the continent's top grand masters. Returning to reality, she coldly ordered Klein to stop standing in a daze and quickly follow her footsteps. Leia definitively demanded the young man never to act familiar, because there was inherently no family relationship between the two of them. Klein slightly frowned, recalling Duke Heinkel's assertion that she was a cousin from the same bloodline, but reality was completely contrary as she was the child of the first wife, meaning the two shared no bloodline and were merely strangers. Leia stated that from now on, her actions would stem entirely from personal curiosity toward the Rhineland youth. Suddenly, she rushed forward, closed in, and shoved Klein hard against the wall, leaving him unable to react and only able to exclaim in astonishment. The female commander leaned her mesmerizing face close and proposed to touch his body right in this place. Amidst the quiet space of the balcony, Klein shockingly questioned the true purpose behind her abrupt and bizarre request. Ignoring his resistance, Leia definitively grabbed the young man's wrist and demanded that he hand over his hands for her to examine. She meticulously observed, then commented that these were a child's hands because they were too soft, lacking a single scar or callus. While Klein was panicking and secretly wondering why she was groping his hands like that, Leia began to analyze the characteristics of seasoned swordsmen. She emphasized that hand tendons do not lie, especially at the sword hilt's pivot points under a warrior's index finger and thumb. Leia looked deep into Klein's eyes and directly asserted that he had actually never held a sword in his life. She doubted how someone who didn't know how to use a sword at all could take down Knight Dalton along with 20 elite mercenaries. Leia began to question whether Klein was hiding and using some kind of mysterious dark power. She suddenly stepped forward and pushed the young man hard against the edge of the balcony, leaving him completely passive and astonished. Klein smirked, thinking her words were ridiculous, and secretly judged that this woman was an extremely dangerous entity. Leia's sharp gaze seemed to be not merely curious, but secretly measuring every smallest reaction on his face. He told himself he had to appear even more confident than his opponent and nonchalantly prepared to pose a bold hypothesis to launch a psychological counterattack. He sarcastically asked what she would think if he were truly the tyrant Archimond, but the only response was the female commander's mocking sneer. Leia bluntly dismissed it and mocked that a wet-behind-the-ears brat like him could never be Archimond. The sudden insult left Klein so stunned that his face changed color, completely blank from the unbelievable shock. His eyes widened in extreme horror as he felt the humiliation that had just struck directly at the pride of a former tyrant. Klein tremblingly questioned her, knowing for sure she intended to use a moniker even worse than a child, while Leia casually asked if he wanted her to repeat it. Leia bluntly insulted Klein that he was too small to be Archimond, with terrible body proportions and a demeanor devoid of any tyrannical pressure. The mocking words completely shattered his spirit, while she continued to assert that he was no swordsman and posed a hypothesis if he had truly defeated a knight. The female commander leaned close to Klein's ear and audaciously declared she would give him her lips as a reward if he could prove his mettle. Klein stood rooted to the spot with a blank face, completely unable to digest the crazy and provocative proposal just now. He narrowed his eyes in suspicion and inwardly mocked what use her lips would be other than causing more trouble for his chaotic mind. While Klein was still pondering whether this was a political conspiracy or a form of bribery, Leia urged him to quickly enter the grand hall. The sunset dyed the sky red behind the mansion as if forecasting the unpredictable variables about to take place inside the majestic council hall. Leia briefly glanced with pensive eyes, secretly affirming in her heart that the real tyrant Archimond would never look like this. The decisive footsteps of Klein and Lady Leia echoed throughout the corridor, signaling the return of the two central figures of the hearing. The young man secretly admitted he had been too careless with his guard, ready to accept the troublesome title of second young master to enter the final battle of wits. Count Delkin stared intently at Klein with a resentful face, silently recalling the past of a troublesome second young master who had been imprisoned by the church for 7 years. Duke Heinkel broke the suffocating atmosphere by speaking up to inquire about the content of the private conversation that just took place between his son and the female commander. Instead of explaining, Klein suddenly drew his sword from its sheath, creating a steely clang that made even Lady Leia startle in astonishment. The young man stood towering in the middle of the grand hall, his hands tightly gripping the sword hilt with a majestic demeanor that made anyone feel fearful. He looked straight into Delkin Cornwell's trembling face and coldly asserted that he would personally prove all the truth. Klein declared he wanted to end all meaningless delays right here and demanded to resolve the conflict in the way of northern men. With eyes burning with determination, he loudly proposed a trial by mortal combat right in the hall. The sudden challenge left Delcan in absolute shock. He stammered and screamed in terror upon hearing about the traditional trial by combat. That was inherently a harsh ancient judgment method of the North, only applied when a case fell into a deadlock. In this battle with no limits on any weapons or techniques, the final result would be the only truth deciding the fate of both families. Delcan shockingly stammered, asking why Klein suddenly proposed such a highly risky form of mortal combat. The young man coldly exposed how the old man deliberately pinned his son's assassination crime onto him despite the clear evidence. Deep down, he secretly affirmed that he was the tyrant Archimond and inherently had no emotions whatsoever for his mother in this life. Klein stepped forward with an intensely pressuring face, demanding the Count to make a choice immediately instead of making everyone wait any longer. The crowd's bustling murmurs about a forgotten ancient tradition made Delkin feel a surging extreme sense of unease. Duke Heinkel officially issued an edict approving the duel to determine the truth in accordance with the spirit of Northern warriors. The fact that all evidence was declared invalid left Delkin stunned, but he also quickly realized a highly profitable loophole. Thinking this was a golden opportunity, he mocked how someone who didn't have a single bit of mana like him dared to confidently step onto the arena. Delkin declared he would send an elite knight to fight in his stead, simultaneously harboring the cruel intention of using someone else's hands to end him. Klein smirked arrogantly, casually demanding the old man to keep his eyes wide open to watch him slaughter Dalton's representative, and secretly cursed them to go to hell. Delcan Cornwell accepted the challenge and declared the battle would take place in 4 days, while Klein inwardly told himself this was only the first step for his plan. He looked at Leia and harbored the intention to turn the Cornwell family into a stepping stone to showcase his true ego, while vowing to smash and rebuild this family from the ruins. The silent night enveloped the majestic mansion as if secretly hiding a political storm that was about to sweep across the continent. Inside the brightly chandelier-lit room, fierce screams of objection rang out, shattering the silent atmosphere of the evening. Delin angrily questioned his younger brother whether he was still sane or not to dare propose a mortal combat so crazy it was unimaginable. Facing his older brother's fury, Klein only tiredly scratched his head and casually asserted that he was too sick of having to repeat the same issue. Delin was so shocked he froze upon hearing the news that Duke Heinkel himself had also voiced his approval for this reckless request of his. The blonde genius eagerly proposed to take his younger brother's place in battle as a representative, but Klein definitively rejected that good intention immediately. He looked at the figures of his father and brother, secretly admitting that the northern prestige still stood firm thanks to the power of these two succeeding swordsmen. Klein crossed his arms, coldly demanding Delin to face reality, because he didn't want his perfect older brother to risk his life for an unworthy duel. Delin anxiously remarked that Klein agreeing to the duel was no different from handing the enemy a legal opportunity to murder the Rhineland heir. He emphasized their strong bond despite having different mothers and the long 7-year wait to welcome his younger brother back from the church. The blonde genius fondly recalled the moment Klein was born, which was the happiest day of his life as he gained a younger brother. The image of the infant's tiny hands gently moving in the cradle had become an unforgettable, sacred memory. At that moment, Delin was utterly stunned and secretly affirmed that he had seemingly just seen an angel descend to earth. Suddenly, he tightly grasped his younger brother's shoulders with intense force, leaving the young man astonished by his brother's sudden wave of emotion. Tears began to roll down as Delin tearfully asked Klein to listen very carefully to his advice before the battle. Klein shockingly looked into the tear-filled eyes of his always resilient older brother and constantly wondered about the reason behind this moment of weakness. He inwardly understood that Delin was extremely furious because his position as the main successor had tied his hands, preventing him from acting on his own. Sitting in deep thought on the sofa, Klein was determined to overcome this trial himself to change the world's perspective instead of letting his older brother bear the burden for him. Delin was still gripping his younger brother's shoulders when Knight Dunkel suddenly appeared to report on a completely new development. The knight captain bowed to apologize for the abruptness and announced that the Cornwell side had officially chosen their representative. The name Randall being uttered immediately left both Rhineland brothers stunned by the opponent's potential danger. Dunkel explained in a low voice that he was a knight previously exiled from the Empire after building a bloody reputation on the battlefield. The door leading to the butcher's dark hidden corner slowly opened, casting a chilling nightmare over the space. The true reason a genius was discarded began to reveal itself, tied to his brutally savage hunting exploits. A crimson liquid like blood was poured full into a cup, signaling the awakening of an uncontrollable murderous instinct. A horrifying massacre flashed back through blood-stained memory fragments, where he had let his frenzy guide him to wipe out all life. Amidst the ruins and corpses, Randall casually downed a cup of wine as a way to satisfy his own soul's thirst. He smirked defiantly when mentioning the title of the Rhineland young master, ready for an upcoming bloody purge. Klein stared into the void with a profound gaze, inwardly preparing himself for the fateful battle about to take place. Right after that, the Guardian Knight presented the newly finished sword, the most crucial weapon in his calculations. Dunkel informed in a low voice that the sword was forged exactly as requested, but still reminded the young master to be extremely careful. He emphasized the fatal flaw that this weapon would instantly shatter if it clashed with mana-infused swords. The young man gave a slight nod of satisfaction and then coldly ordered his subordinate to set out immediately to be on time for the judgment. Klein appeared majestically under the sunny blue sky, holding the fateful sword and walking with the demeanor of a monarch. His appearance sent a shockwave through the entire stands, the crowd constantly whispering and gossiping upon seeing the Rhineland family's trash actually dare to show up. Sitting in the seats of honor, Count Delcan sneered triumphantly and showed disbelief at the young man's recklessness. He smugly reminded them that his representative was a renowned Empire knight, someone who would easily crush a child with no mana. Delcan continued to mock that it wasn't too late if the Duke wanted to change his mind and send the genius Deline to fight instead of his useless son. Klein looked around the vast arena and secretly wondered where his opponent was currently hiding. He narrowed his eyes cautiously, focusing all his senses to prepare for a confrontation with the entity known as the battlefield's nightmare. Suddenly, a massive dark shadow with glowing red eyes like a demon materialized above, radiating a terrifying pressure that enveloped the young man. Randall landed on the ground, creating a powerful impact that sent blinding dust high into the air, officially making his appearance before tens of thousands of witnesses. The butcher with a heavily scarred face and a dull, cold gaze asked if the tiny person in front of him was truly young Master Klein. That was the Cornwell family's trump card, the Mad Knight Randall, who possessed brutal physical strength capable of crushing all obstacles. He mocked that he looked much greener than the rumors suggested, while Klein maintained a mysterious, emotionless face. His gigantic hand suddenly reached out to grab his prey, accompanied by a savage threat that he would snap his neck immediately. But Klein quickly executed a masterful backward jump at wind-tearing speed, escaping the giant's attack by a hair's breadth. The crowd of spectators was simultaneously astonished by his agile footwork and kept whispering and gossiping about his recent action. Delcan sarcastically asked Duke Heinkel whether he saw Klein trembling even before the official confrontation began. Meanwhile, the butcher Randall looked down with a triumphant expression, believing the tiny prey had been completely subdued by his murderous intent. Klein sweated profusely and inwardly admitted that he had just experienced a moment so terrifying that his limbs felt weak. He suddenly recalled the chilling pressure when Priest Garrison grabbed his shoulder the other time, a haunting memory that caused him to momentarily lose his composure. Looking at the giant before him, he secretly cursed the old priest as a useless person for leaving behind such troublesome psychological traumas up to this moment. From the soaring balcony, Lady Leia still quietly watched Klein's every move with a highly calculating gaze. Ignoring her subordinate's warning about Madame Huyen's wrath, she calmly asserted that she didn't care about that non-blood-related mother anyway. With eyes burning with ambition, Leia inwardly repeated her vow to bestow her kiss as a worthy reward if he won. Klein stood in the middle of the dusty arena, suppressing his humiliation to focus on confirming an important hypothesis about the strength of his new body. He softly cleared his throat to hide his embarrassment and justified his recent bizarre action as being caused by his chronic neck pain. Randall aggressively grabbed Klein's shoulder, while the young man calmly reminded him not to touch his body carelessly. With a cold, sharp gaze, he contemptuously called him a perverted brute and sarcastically asked if his ears were also full of nothing but muscle. The jibe about being discarded by the Empire like a bad debt caused the butcher to freeze with a stunned and astonished expression. Randall flashed a cruel smile, asserting that the more toxic his mouth was, the louder his painful screams would echo later on. He swung his giant fist straight down at Klein's head with 1,000 pounds of force, determined to crush his opponent's arrogance on the spot. At that highly precarious moment, Klein calmly pressed a secret device on his chest armor, signaling a strange transformation. Randall's punch struck the ground like thunder, creating a horrific mana explosion that sent shattered bricks and stones flying everywhere. The terrible shockwave formed a deep crater in the middle of the arena, enveloping the entire area in a chillingly thick cloud of dust. The Mad Knight looked down at the ruins with a highly doubtful expression upon noticing something unusual about the sensation of impact just now. Randall shockingly realized that only an empty coat remained in his hand at this moment, while his true prey had disappeared without a trace. The crowd in the stands screamed in terror witnessing the ground crack violently under the Mad Knight's terrifying power, while Randall stood frozen in shock as he realized he was merely grasping an empty coat amidst the thick cloud of dust. With a wind-tearing movement, Klein timely escaped his opponent's attack range and landed very softly. The Rhineland youth stood tall in the middle of the arena, exuding a composed yet highly mysterious aura that made the enemy wary. He softly breathed a sigh of relief and secretly evaluated his opponent's ferocity, simultaneously well aware that a direct confrontation would be extremely disadvantageous. Klein told himself he would shatter if hit by a direct blow from the giant, so he decided not to hold back for even another second. From above, Deline couldn't help but feel restless with worry, wondering how his younger brother could defeat such a terrifying entity. The blonde knight's gaze was tinged with melancholy, believing his brother was embarking on a path to death just to protect the clan's dignity. Facing 1,000 pounds of pressure, Klein inwardly understood that he could not act on emotion because the family's fate now rested entirely on his shoulders. The battle erupted once again with Randall's violent stomp, creating a terrifying mana explosion that enveloped the entire space. Randall swung his giant fist straight down at Klein's position with 1,000 pounds of force, tearing through the air. Klein's eyes suddenly flashed a magical purple light as he focused his entire mind on the sword to prepare for a transformation. The butcher Randall smirked, his face clearly showing excitement and contempt for the prey he believed was struggling in despair. The young man leaped lightly into the air, escaping the Mad Knight's thunderous punch by a hair's breadth. The sword tip touched the floor, creating brilliant electric sparks, marking the start of a series of highly calculated counterattacks. Klein glided across the arena with agile, wind-tearing footwork, leaving a long white trail behind him that astonished the spectators. Randall immediately spun around to launch another violent attack, determined to press forward and deny the young man any chance to recover his breath. He roared in fury upon seeing Klein continuously dodge and asked if he intended to win solely by running away. Randall became even more enraged as the match dragged on. He directly questioned why he still refused to use necromancy to fight back. Under 1,000 pounds of pressure from the opponent's strikes, Klein gritted his teeth to endure while the knight incessantly mocked the weakness of the one bearing the title of Tyrant Archimond. Randall stood stunned and bewildered, his eyes widening in terror as he realized his prey had escaped the fatal blow in a split second. Meanwhile, Klein smirked mysteriously, as if he had grasped all of his opponent's vulnerabilities. He secretly felt annoyed and began considering using the forbidden art of necromancy to instantly wipe out all the trouble in this place. A chilling murderous intent suddenly enveloped Randall, causing the frenzied knight to tremble before a premonition of death. The butcher tried to rush forward and put all his strength into a violent sword swing, but that action was now merely a hopeless struggle. The crowd in the stands constantly whispered in astonishment upon seeing the renowned knight seemingly taking the initiative to dodge an attack from a piece of trash. Sweat poured profusely down his heavily scarred face. Randall couldn't fathom what bizarre power had just manifested and then vanished without a trace. Right behind Klein's small figure, the giant silhouette of the Grim Reaper carrying a death scythe gradually materialized hauntingly amidst the purple night. Count Delcan was restless on his seat, gritting his teeth in fury and constantly questioning why his trump card was acting so bizarrely. Facing the chaos of the Grand Hall, Duke Heinkel only observed silently with a deep, pensive gaze, as if he had seen through the truth of this earth-shattering secret. Klein nonchalantly reassured Randall that he would not use necromancy or any similar forbidden art in this match. With a proud smile, he loudly asserted his status as a legitimate member of the Rhineland family. He emphasized that this was a stage dedicated strictly to proving one's mettle through the power of pure sword strikes. That arrogant declaration left Deline completely stunned with astonishment, while Duke Heinkel still quietly observed with a deep, pensive gaze. Wild cheers erupted across the stands cheering for the Rhineland young master, creating a highly boisterous atmosphere. Count Delcan initially sneered triumphantly, but his smile quickly distorted when he noticed the sudden turnaround. Randall was dripping with sweat, his face tense as he gradually realized that his opponent's words were absolutely not empty threats. Believing what just occurred was merely a fluke, the butcher tightly gripped his weapon and inwardly told himself he still held overwhelming physical superiority. Determined not to let someone with no mana like Klein dominate him, Randall began to activate a fiery red magical energy that enveloped his entire body. He showcased the powerful imperial swordsmanship technique, releasing all of his mana without any restraint to crush the young man in a single strike. Randall roared frantically, focusing all his senses into an explosive attack aimed at finishing his opponent in a single beat. The Mad Knight rushed forward like a flaming arrow, determined to drown the Rhineland name into the deep abyss of defeat. With a powerful swing of his arm, Randall created a fiery red magical energy that swept across the arena, tearing everything in its path apart. Klein calmly activated his mystical purple eye, inwardly affirming that he had seen through the opponent's entire movement trajectory. Every smallest detail in his opponent's technique and blade path was clearly visible before the former tyrant's divine perception. Randall screamed in fury, frantically swinging his sword to create red streaks of light that enveloped the narrow space. Every vicious move of the butcher was seen through by Klein down to the finest detail, not missing a single thing. The Mad Knight gritted his teeth, insulting him as a troublesome fly upon seeing his attacks continuously avoided. Randall channeled all his murderous intent into a finishing slash, roaring for Klein to die on the spot to end this farce. But that thunderous strike only tore through empty air, creating a fiery red mana explosion while the young man's figure had completely vanished. A thick cloud of dust enveloped Randall as he could only stare with wide, terrified eyes at an unbelievable reality. Amidst the ruins, the butcher shockingly realized that he had seemingly been completely seen through by Klein from the very beginning. Randall wonderingly questioned himself how the young man could precisely track every single one of his movement trajectories in a split second. Suddenly from midair, Klein manifested like a phantom gliding across the sky, signaling a fatal counterattack. He slightly smirked, declaring that with such a massive physique, the opening behind the giant's back was wide open. A slash glowing with a magical purple hue struck straight down at Randall's body, causing fresh blood to splatter amidst the tense atmosphere. Witnessing the recent technique, the entire stand shook as Deline and the others shockingly uttered the name Meteor Sword. Randall screamed in agonizing pain, utterly unable to accept the reality that he was being completely overwhelmed by a useless brat. Klein looked down with glowing purple eyes full of mystique, leaving the Mad Knight to desperately wonder how someone with no mana possessed such terrifying power. The adjutant anxiously called out Commander Leia's name upon witnessing the battle turning according to a script no one could have anticipated. Leia shockingly narrowed her eyes, tracking the match, and asked her subordinate in astonishment whether they had just seen the young man's terrifying speed. Amidst the majestic Rhineland mansion setting, Duke Heinkel inwardly thought that under normal circumstances, he would have personally stepped in to intervene. He bitterly explained to Dunkel that he could not act on emotion because with just one small mistake, the family's reputation would completely collapse. The loyal knight anxiously questioned why he approved this match knowing for sure Klein did not have a single chance of survival against an Empire knight. Heinkel silently admitted Klein was fighting to protect his late mother's honor, and he regretted not protecting him when he was falsely accused of being Archimond. He clenched both hands in extreme torment, blaming himself for being an incompetent person who ultimately could not protect anyone. Witnessing his lord's suffering, Dunkel advised him that he no longer needed to bear the past sins toward his family by himself. The knight captain's gaze turned solemn as he silently called out young Master Klein's name, a new faith gradually igniting in his heart. Duke Heinkel looked up with pensive eyes, as if he had begun to realize an earth-shattering secret was gradually revealing itself through the battle. Returning to the arena, Klein swung the meteor sword glowing with a purple hue, tearing open his opponent's chest, asserting that he never entered a battle he wasn't sure of winning. Duke Heinkel shockingly looked toward his son and silently called out Klein's name upon witnessing the astonishing transformation in the match. The long sword glowing with a pale blue aura manifested like a reminder of the Northern Rhineland swordsmanship family's prestige. While the Empire's swordsmanship carried a brutally predatory nature, compared to the image of a lion frantically pouncing on its prey. This fighting style tended to overwhelm the enemy by detonating the entire accumulation of magical energy in a single strike. Contrary to that violence, the image of a pair of gentle rabbits appeared like a highly implicit visual contrast between the combat styles. But the moment murderous intent arose, those tiny entities suddenly became dark and chilling, as if secretly hiding an unimaginable danger. He inwardly affirmed that the Rhineland family's style inherently lay in restraint, represented by the sharp gaze of the Northern Eagle. It was the art of patiently waiting for the opponent's opening before unleashing the finishing blow with a meager amount of mana but achieving maximum efficiency. Standing tall amidst the arena's dust, Klein understood that this was the true core of the swordsman bloodline flowing in his veins. He concluded that the pinnacle of swordsmanship was achieving maximum efficiency for minimum energy, turning oneself into a true ruler. Klein coldly asserted that thanks to the secret art of mana restraint, someone without a single shred of magic power like him could still execute the family's technique. Although this move lacked the violent strength of mana, he was firmly convinced it was more than enough to take down a brute knight like Randall. The Mad Knight gritted his teeth in anger, calling him a little mouse, while feeling his self-esteem deeply wounded by the sarcastic words. He roared in a frenzy and began to release his entire murderous intent to prepare for a true massacre. Randall's body turned fiery red and swollen due to the excessive explosion of mana, as he did not hesitate to sacrifice his physical form in exchange for destructive power. Count Delcan cheered triumphantly upon realizing his trump card was executing the signature technique that had forged his reputation. That was Mana Burst, a vicious skill capable of locking down all of the opponent's movements and leaving them helplessly watching death approach. Klein still maintained an emotionless face before his opponent's ferocity, inwardly considering the butcher's declarations to be nothing but a cheap joke. Randall channeled all his strength into a flaming slash, roaring with absolute confidence that he would be the final victor in this arena. From the stands, Deline screamed in horror, demanding his younger brother to be careful as the strike carrying the opponent's explosive power was rushing forward at terrifying speed. Randall frantically swung violent slashes carrying a crimson mana glow, but it seemed he was only hitting illusory afterimages. A sparks flying clash occurred when Klein's sword directly confronted the Mad Knight's broadsword in the middle of the arena. The young man recalled the moment he received the custom-forged sword and the warning that it would shatter if it touched mana. Just as predicted, Klein's blade began to fracture heavily under the 1,000-pound pressure from Randall's violent attack. The sharp fragments scattered everywhere, signaling the destruction of the only weapon he possessed. Randall laughed triumphantly seeing his opponent's sword destroyed, firmly believing that Klein was now just a fish on the chopping board. He poured all his strength into the finishing slash, smugly asserting that this was the price to pay for the arrogance of a good-for-nothing. Yet Klein maintained a mysterious smile with his eyes glowing an eerie, bright purple, inwardly affirming that all the final cards were ready. He coldly declared that this was the ultimate weapon forged specifically to send the Mad Knight to hell. The image of a pristine white feather falling before the giant lion served as a deadly metaphor for the predator's end. The image of the pristine white feather gently falling before the giant lion appeared as a deeply serene metaphor, only for the shadow of a massive eagle to spread its wings immediately afterward, enveloping the collapsing beast, symbolizing the absolute dominance of the Rhineland family's swordsmanship style. Back to the brutal reality of the arena, Randall's rough hand was still tightly gripping the hilt of the completely shattered weapon amidst splashing splinters of blood. That was the result of the fatal slash carrying Klein's eerie purple aura, decisively tearing open the giant Mad Knight's chest in the blink of an eye. The butcher's blood-soaked hand gradually went limp on the sword hilt, the bulging green veins testifying to the helplessness and tragic end of the one who once sowed so much terror. Witnessing that the victory and defeat were clear, Duke Heinkel with a solemn face spoke up to order a stop, officially closing the bloody death match. The declaration of the match ending rang out, leaving the nobles in the grandstand unable to hide their shock, their eyes widening and sweating profusely as they witnessed an outcome beyond all imagination. Meanwhile, Knight Dunkel frowned in analysis, inwardly admiring that the second young master had actually perfectly executed the family's movement skills and sword-swinging trajectories with the absolute minimum amount of mana. Standing tall before the collapsing massive body of his opponent, Klein secretly admitted that he had intentionally baited Randall into destroying the sword to have an excuse to close the distance and deliver the finishing blow at close range. The young man glanced over with his eyes gleaming an eerie red, proudly asserting in his mind that he had achieved the most perfect victory. Randall's giant arm was severed in midair along with gushing fresh blood, causing the butcher to roll his eyes back and scream in agonizing pain. He rolled on the dirt and sand, while the medical team rushed over, shouting loudly to demand quick containment and bleeding control. The mages cast blue light magic to pin down Randall's struggling body, even as Klein stood by watching indifferently. He lightly stroked his chin and calmly asked the medical team if the severed arm could be reattached. A sweating mage explained they only had enough power for first aid to fit a prosthetic arm later, making Klein raise an eyebrow in disappointment, asking back if they could only do that much. Klein inwardly criticized the healing magic for stagnating for the past 200 years, when suddenly Duke Heinkel's steady voice rang out, calling his name. The majestic father stared intently in scrutiny, asking in a strict tone if the bloody scene just now really did not scare him at all. Klein suddenly broke into a sweat, realizing his calm demeanor just now had accidentally exposed his tyrant nature instead of a normal teenager's. To fix the situation, he hurriedly scratched his head, pretending to be awkward and secretly calculating whether he should act panicked to deceive everyone. Contrary to that face, Count Delcan in the grandstand was screaming in despair, driven mad because he could not accept completely losing the massive amount of money spent to recruit Randall. Duke Heinkel coldly demanded Count Cornwell to admit his guilt and submit to the winner according to the agreement of the judgment duel. Pushed to the brink, Delcan frantically screamed in refusal, outraged because he had lost both his son and his trusted knight. His eyes widened as he questioned how they could make him bow his head, but before his words could finish, a cold and sharp dark shadow tore through the wind and rushed forward. The illusion of his head being cleanly severed flashed through his mind, causing Delcan to tremble in sheer panic. He snapped out of it, sweating profusely as he realized he had just walked right past the boundary of death. Klein smirked arrogantly, his sharp, cold eyes locking onto the target as he growled Delcan Cornwell's name like a pronouncement of sentence. He rushed forward, tightly gripping the Count's throat, pinning the target to everyone's astonishment. As the victor, Klein coldly ordered him to kneel and confess his sins before the ruler of the North and beg for forgiveness. The ironclad order rang out, demanding the sinner to bow his head and accept the punishment of being crushed under the weight of the very crimes he had committed. A burst of purple malevolent aura exploded, completely crushing Delcan's will to resist, forcing him to collapse in submission. As soon as the death match concluded, the image of the Grim Reaper holding a blood-stained scythe suddenly appeared, suffocating the soul and leaving Delcan completely stunned. His eyes widened as he trembled in sheer terror, clearly feeling the dark mana pressure gnawing away at his last shred of sanity. The arrogant sinner was now completely broken, humiliatingly kneeling at Klein's feet to the amazement of tens of thousands of spectators. But in reality, the second young master had secretly cast Dead Man's Voice, an ancient necromancer art specialized in breaking the will of the living. In his panic, Delcan sobbed and confessed to plotting a cruel assassination attempt with his son to seize the family's power. His tears mixed with fresh blood as he repeatedly kowtowed, apologizing for insulting the honor of the late Lady Claire. Witnessing the pillar of the Branch family collapse miserably, the nobles in the grandstand could only gape in astonishment at the transformation of the former good-for-nothing. Under the clear blue sky, Klein raised his blood-stained broken sword high as an ironclad warning to those who still harbored treacherous intentions. He boldly declared that this was only the first step to bringing the glory of the Rhineland family back to its most glorious era. With the cold, sharp eyes of a tyrant, the young man officially asserted his position as the future master, forcing everyone to bow his head. Klein boldly declared himself as the son bearing the bloodline of Lady Claire and Duke Heinkel, the greatest knight to ever rule the northern lands. The powerful declaration echoed throughout the grandstand, where his majestic father was silently observing with eyes filled with deep emotions. Under the brilliant sunshine, the young man proudly raised his broken sword, standing tall before thousands of admiring eyes like a true sovereign. The scene shifted to the sacred space of the church, where a white stone statue of the goddess of light was clasping her hands in prayer amidst sunbeams piercing through the windows. A cardinal with a weathered face closed his eyes tightly in prayer, devoutly asking the goddess to guide the darkest places. Steady footsteps echoed on the marble floor, signaling the arrival of an important guest bearing shocking news. It was the butcher priest Garrison, who quietly entered from the main door, bringing an aura of solemnity and a lingering sense of bloodlust. Cardinal Muroc slowly opened his eyes, calling out Garrison's name in a deep tone and inquiring about the recent incidents, his voice growing heavy. Garrison respectfully reported that the surveillance target had just been attacked by a necromancer and his tattered army of the undead. However, the cardinal appeared exceptionally calm, coldly asserting that there was no need to worry as everything was firmly within the church's control. Cardinal Muroc revealed that the Dark Mage was originally sent to cooperate with the Imperial Army to execute a secret mission. He smirked, explaining that the nature of necromancers is to sow absolute terror in anyone who faces them, and when humans are pushed to the brink by that horror, they will inevitably turn back to seek the Lord's protection to cling to a hope of survival. From there, thousands of desperate believers will flock in droves and obediently fall right into the manipulative embrace of the Holy Church. Garrison glared in outrage at this cruel conspiracy, loudly criticizing a servant of the Church for daring to sell himself to vile political ploys and colluding with heresy. Cardinal Muroc remained unbothered, turning his back and coldly warning Garrison to understand that to revive order and spread the word of God, a few small sacrifices are mandatory. Yet, before the hypocritical justification could finish, Garrison suddenly lunged forward at a terrifying speed, tightly gripping the cardinal's throat and lifting him high into the air. Muroc's eyes widened in absolute panic, sweating profusely as he continuously struggled and screamed, asking what this crazy priest was trying to do. The statue of the goddess of light silently shed tears of crimson blood onto her pale stone face, serving as a testament to the defilement taking place right in the middle of the sanctuary. Garrison crushed the cardinal's head on the spot, the broken corpse falling with a thud onto the floor while a mysterious figure stepped out from the shadows, asking if he felt any better. The archbishop stepped over the corpses, mockingly remarking that Garrison slaughtered his own brethren more than necromancers did. Palamon L smirked, asserting that the world would be horrified to know the cruel nature behind his righteous facade. The butcher priest glared, coldly questioning whether this purge was the other's command. Palamon denied it, stating he only authorized it, while revealing he had just brought some noteworthy information. He provided confidential documents about the surveillance target as his footsteps glided past the pools of blood. Garrison silently focused as he began to realize the gravity of the analysis regarding the magic. The Archbishop asserted that any art manipulating death leaves behind indelible traces of mana. He held out a cross-shaped holy flask containing traces from the necromancer Garrison had just eliminated. Inside were two types of vapor, the resurrection art of the Empire and an ancient art capable of bending souls. Garrison stood stunned before the presence of primal necromancy, which Palamon decisively confirmed. Klein's identity was almost exposed when Archbishop Palamon revealed that there were actually two necromancers appearing at the scene. He requested Garrison to pay special attention to the moment Deline was tightly hugging his younger brother to find a vulnerability. Because the most important surveillance target in the eyes of the church right now was none other than the second young master of the Rhineland family. The butcher priest pondered, speculating about the true nature the young man was trying to hide behind his harmless appearance. Meanwhile, Klein still stood quietly amidst the protection of his family, completely unaware that his secret had been seen through long ago, only for an ironclad affirmation to ring out, officially confirming that Klein Rhineland was actually a powerful necromancer. The conversation temporarily concluded with Garrison's profound gaze, opening the next chapter titled The Necromancer of the Mines. The setting shifted to a stormy, misty night, where the gloomy entrance to the mine flickered with a haunting firelight. Heavy pickaxe blows struck against the crystal rock layer, sending bright sparks flying amidst the silent space. A lone miner worked diligently, signaling a new incident about to befall the northern family of sword masters. The miner trembled as a massive dark shadow with sharp talons silently materialized from behind his back. He stood stunned in terror, sweating profusely as he faced an entity far beyond his imagination right inside the dark mine. A piercing, agonizing scream echoed across the rainy forest, marking the beginning of a bloody incident at the border region. At the Rhineland mansion, Erin was worried sick looking at the handicraft in her hand, blaming herself for causing a huge disaster. She had accidentally sewn a doll with the face of the second young master, but it looked exactly like a cursed effigy. A week had passed since the duel, yet Erin still continuously laughed and teased him while Klein could only remain in a weary silence. The young man quietly recalled the scene of himself using the meteor sword ultimate technique to defeat the Mad Knight and force the enemy to confess. He remembered the moment he proudly asserted his position before the entire Branch family, believing he had truly struck terror into them. However, the reality was that this 15-year-old body was reaching its limit of endurance. He wearily requested the maid to quickly go to sleep so he could have some peace. Ignoring Erin's pouting when being dismissed as just messing around, Klein still concentrated intensely on the pile of books to find a way to overcome his current body's limitations. Erin whined and teased the second young master who was just playing around with a harmless novel, but hidden behind that disguised cover were pages containing forbidden knowledge for necromancers, where it meticulously detailed human anatomy, magic circuits, and ancient undead summoning arrays. Klein pondered, assessing that his current body's summoning limit was too low to face major battles. He told himself he had to quickly restore his original strength before that butcher priest Garrison could discover him. His research was interrupted when Duke Heinkel presented a report about strange monsters appearing at the mine. Upon seeing the drawings of the hideous undead, Klein knew for sure this was exactly the clue he had been looking for. He firmly declared he would depart immediately, believing that real combat is the most effective way to research. Heinkel showed concern for his son's safety upon learning that casualties had already begun to appear there. Klein replied with a confident look, inwardly affirming that the undead in the mining region were definitely related to the one who had assassinated him. Dunkel smiled brightly, announcing that he would be the escort, which secretly made Klein glad as this was a good opportunity to freely use necromancy without being scrutinized. Under the sparkling starry night sky, the knight captain marveled that the natural scenery on this trip was truly wonderful. He kindly handed Klein a grilled meat skewer and reminded the second young master to quickly eat his meal while the food was still hot. Dunkel looked full of pride about the fruits of his labor, while Klein just quietly took the food with a highly skeptical expression. The young man secretly thought he should also do something useful to contribute to the journey instead of just sitting still and enjoying. However, the harsh reality emerged when looking at the meat charred black as coal, making Klein bitterly realize that him sitting still was actually the most helpful. This trip taught Klein an unexpected lesson that the knight captain Dunkel was completely useless in mundane matters like hunting or cooking. Dunkel awkwardly apologized for his clumsiness, but Klein just coldly demanded him to focus on eating and that he would personally grill the next batch. Looking into the firelight, the former tyrant secretly compared this inconvenience, thinking it was nothing compared to 10 years of fleeing from the Night Order's pursuit. Klein silently observed his loyal retainer by the campfire, secretly preparing himself mentally for the dangerous trials waiting at the mine. Dunkel observed Klein and commented that he was nothing like kids his age, from his swordsmanship skills to his poised demeanor in the duel. The knight captain even boldly speculated that the second young master could very well be the reincarnation of the tyrant Archimond. Klein immediately warned Dunkel in a strict tone to absolutely never bring that up again in front of Priest Garrison if he didn't want to bring disaster upon himself. Dunkel added that Archimond was a demon who turned millions of northerners into the undead, making Klein pause briefly with heavy eyes. The campfire flared up fiercely in the dark night, unintentionally highlighting more clearly the tense silence enveloping the master and retainer. Suddenly, a strange noise tore through the space, making Dunkel startle and doubt whether it was just the sound of the wind. Klein replied with a cold shake of his head, his expression suddenly becoming solemn as he sensed an uninvited presence. With eyes gleaming with a sharp look, he growled, demanding Dunkel to never bring up that painful subject ever again from now on. The terrifying pressure from the second young master made Dunkel sweat profusely. He stammered his master's name in utter shock. While the atmosphere was extremely tense, a piercing scream rang out, forcing the knight to immediately draw his sword and prepare for battle. A piercing scream tore through the quiet atmosphere of the town, signaling the official beginning of the undead nightmare. The townsfolk fled in panic as the undead suddenly poured out from the shadows, frantically hunting down innocent lives. With soullessly glowing eyes, the hideous monsters roared and lunged forward, turning the streets into a bloody arena. In the heat of the moment, a blinding surge of mana erupted as the knights began to launch suppressive strikes. Dunkel bravely swung his sword to deliver powerful slashes, knocking the undead away and opening a blood path for the civilians. However, the knight captain suddenly stopped in terror, calling out the second young master's name in astonishment when he saw him throwing himself into a deadly situation. To Dunkel's amazement, Klein quietly swung his eerie purple glowing sword, tearing apart the giant monster's body in the blink of an eye. He coldly glanced over and questioned Dunkel about what he was still standing there blankly waiting for in the middle of a battlefield. With the authority of a leader, Klein decisively ordered the knight to quickly go and assist the civilians in distress. The undead's head fell to the ground with a thud, ending the life of the one who dared to block the path of the gradually awakening tyrant. Amidst the rubble, the bewildered civilians asked for their savior's identity, while Dunkel loudly introduced that this was the second young master of the Rhineland family. The knight captain immediately questioned them about when the monsters first appeared, aiming to find clues for the investigation. Klein quietly observed the corpses, inwardly confirming that this was a resurrection art similar to the one used by the person who attacked him in the forest. The civilians painfully recounted the tragedy that began 2 months ago, right when the mine was locked down and villagers continuously went missing. Klein was stunned hearing the man affirm that those hideous undead were actually their neighbors in the area. In a state of distress, the man rushed over and clung tightly to Klein, screaming and questioning whether he was truly a member of the noble Rhineland family. Dunkel hurriedly intervened, but the villager still frantically shook the second young master to vent his long pent-up resentment. He cried and criticized the callousness of the ruling class, as they had been begging for help for 2 whole months without receiving a single reply. With bloodshot eyes, he tremblingly pointed at the corpse just killed by Klein's sword slash with a deeply sorrowful attitude. He sobbed, calling it his father, an honest miner who was turned into a monster after days of grueling work deep down in the mine. The villagers screamed in despair, bitterly questioning why poor people like them had to suffer this painful tragedy. Klein stood motionless amidst the rubble, the surrounding atmosphere suddenly becoming heavy and melancholic due to the immense pain of someone who had lost a loved one. Faint images of the tyrant Archimond and the resentment of millions of souls from the past suddenly rushed back, evoking the true identity he was hiding. He softly asked the other party to remain silent, his tightly pursed lips showing a patience that was gradually reaching its limit of endurance. With his eyes flashing a fierce purple, Klein coldly shouted that the man was being too noisy and firmly asserted that everything that happened was not his fault. The radiating mana pressure made the villagers' eyes widen in sheer terror, completely suffocated by the terrifying aura of the second young master. He growled, reminding him that he was not the one who turned his father into the undead, while demanding that if he wanted to vent his anger, he should choose the right target to hate. Dunkel intended to step forward to settle the matter, but Klein quickly gathered a blazing blue soul fire on the palm of his hand to prepare for a mysterious ritual. To the knight's astonishment, he began chanting a spell to summon the departed innocent souls and declared he would use the light to guide and illuminate their path. The corpses on the ground began to convulse and rise under the guidance of Klein Rhineland, officially fulfilling the final wishes of the deceased. Klein boldly asked everyone to put their trust in him and follow his lead to seek the truth. Gentle blue wisps of soul fire began to emerge from the bodies of those who had just fallen. Amidst the bewilderment of Dunkel and the villagers, countless spiritual entities materialized, hovering and surrounding the second young master. The silhouette of the deceased father appeared in the blue light along with mysterious ancient characters fluctuating in the air. Klein quietly observed the messages of the dead gradually becoming clear through the ancient characters of primal necromancy. He nodded slightly and inwardly affirmed that he had understood all their feelings as well as their final wishes. Dunkel stood rooted to the spot, terrified to realize that this was soul resonance, a soul resonance technique only found in legends. He silently recalled that this was a secret art used 200 years ago to free souls from the suffering of the pandemic. The villager sobbed, calling out to his father when he saw his relative's soul miraculously return right before his eyes. The father's soul smiled one last time before gradually fading into luminous dust particles, officially finding eternal peace. The ribbons of blue souls gradually faded into the night, leaving a melancholic atmosphere enveloping the small town. Under the bright full moon shining across the galaxy, all things seemed to hold their breath before the impending storm. The sound of leather boots hitting the dry, rocky ground signaled the beginning of an arduous journey. Klein and Dunkel walked quietly between the sheer cliffs, heading towards the abandoned mine in a terrifying silence. He recalled the villagers' terrified instructions about the trail leading straight to the monster's lair. Amidst the quiet space, Dunkel asked the second young master in a deep voice about the true content of the conversation with the deceased. Klein paused briefly with a profound expression, his eyes harboring an indescribable emotion when mentioning the past. He explained that those souls did not only express their gratitude for being freed but also entrusted a final wish. Dunkel was stunned hearing Klein reveal that they had earnestly begged him to exact a blood debt on their behalf. Pressing his lips together with firm resolve, the young man affirmed that he would carry out this revenge exactly as he had declared. Klein growled, repeating his warning, demanding Dunkel to absolutely never breathe a word about whether he was the reincarnation of the tyrant Archimond or not. The captain tightly gripped the hilt of his sword, looking at the second young master's reflection on the cold, sharp steel blade to prepare to ask one final question. Dunkel pointed the tip of his sword at Klein, growling and demanding him to answer honestly who he truly was in the end.